proceed, please. So where we're going to jump back in is on slide 95, which is where we begin the conversation about day, employment, and transportation services. So unlike residential, we do have some suppositions that we're going to be combining service codes here. In particular, we're looking at consolidating the existing service codes for most of those day programs into a smaller number of service codes, or potentially a single or couple of service codes with various subcodes. But in particular, what we're looking at doing is establishing rates for community-based services and center-based services. So we first differentiate on that basis, and as we'll talk about in a minute, the way that works is by going away from daily billing to hourly billing, which some folks I know read ahead and noticed. And then furthermore, differentiating between the types of programs. So based upon the conversations we actually had with the DS task force, we talked about groups, day programs that are designed specifically for folks with medical needs, and day programs designed specifically for folks with behavioral needs. So we'll ultimately have to develop regulations that talk about what the requirements of those services are and the eligibility for who can access those services. But right now, we've built rate models that support those three different program types: medical, behavioral, and neither. And then two different service locations: community-based and center-based services. And so you'll see all the service codes that we get wrapped into that overarching framework. We have 028, although for tracking purposes, that would continue to be either a standalone service code or subcode, but from a rate modeling perspective, the rates would be the same as what we see for the remaining services. And then we have the traditional day program codes, the 505, 510, 515, and 525. The lookalike day programs funded under 055 and 063, and then the creative arts program under 094. From there, maintaining an in-home day program service, maintaining participant-directed community-based training. That gets us through today. Then moving to employment on the subsequent slide. Again, we would be folding in employment services that are currently delivered under 055 and 063 into the 952 and 950 frameworks. So again, that just reiterates the point I made earlier this morning, but I know it's a significant one because there's a lot of spending going on under 055 and 063. Those service codes would be eliminated, and the supports that are being provided would not be eliminated, but they would be farmed out, so to speak, to the service code that corresponds to what's actually being done. So it could be done on an individualized basis for like independent living or supported living or personal assistance. It could be done as a lookalike day program, which would be under this new framework, or it could be under supported employment, which would move it under 952 and 950. And again, this is one small element, but conversations come up throughout the day about the need for statutory or regulatory changes, and supported employment is an example of that, because right now there's language that says supported employment can only be delivered by nonprofit providers, and certainly there's for-profit providers that are delivering employment supports under one of these miscellaneous service codes. We would have to make some changes in order to allow that to be transitioned ultimately to the 952 and 950 codes. Within individualized supported employment, we would break that out between two different types of service. So we have job development and then job coaching. It's been our experience, and I think we've talked about this previously as a group, that the folks delivering those two types of supports typically have different skill sets. Then we have work activity programs, which continue as its own standalone service code, and then the supplemental day program support under service code 110. Then finally in this section, transportation. So from a rate modeling perspective, we would be combining the transportation company and the transportation additional components into a single rate framework. We would continue to have a transportation assistant rate, and then we're thinking about changing the way the coordination or brokerage function is handled, so expanding it beyond just transportation brokers to a coordination function that allows more consistency across the way that service is currently built. And we'll talk about that towards the back end of this section. So for day services, we are proposing that they would be billed on an hourly basis, which is different than many of the existing day services under those 500 series codes. We're proposing a number of different rate variants. So we already talked about the program focus, the medical, the behavioral, and the neither. There will, of course, be geography-based adjustments. We talked about the service location, center-based services, and community-based services. There will be different rates for different staffing ratios, which is the current practice today, particularly under those 500 series codes. And then there would be a rate for the non-English stipend. Again, similar to what we talked about with the residential services, in order to access that rate, it would have to be, the consumer would have to have access to the person speaking their language at all times. That we have to have an on-site person speaking their language in order for the provider to bill that rate. And so this is going to add, as day program providers can probably think about, some degree of complexity to the way that services are authorized and tracked. So the way we've thought about this is the need to vendorize a given program as either medical or behavioral or neither. As an aside, the medical programs we're envisioning being staffed by CNAs, and the behavioral programs being staffed by RBTs. And then for a given program, you're going to need a separate approval or authorization for the staffing ratio. And there's going to be two different staffing ratios because you're going to need to have one both for community-based services and one for center-based services. They could potentially be the same, but what's more likely is you'll have a more intensive staffing ratio during the community hours than you have during the center or facility-based hours. And so what would be permitted under the center-based is ratios that go from 1 to 2 up to 1 to 10, which is what's currently permitted under the various day programs that exist today. But community-based services would be capped at a 1 to 3 ratio. So in order to bill a community-based rate, you could staff it at no more than one, or no fewer than one staff person for every 3 consumers. Then when we think about this from a billing perspective, the billing is going to reflect where the services are delivered. So if someone is in your program for 6 hours in a day, and they're at the center between 9 and 12, and then in the community between 12 and 3, you'll be billing 3 hours of the appropriate center-based rate and 3 hours of the appropriate community-based rate. So we'll walk through a rate model to show, go ahead.
Hi, Harry Gold, Pathline. A quick question on the maximum ratio.
Can't hear you.
Geez, they really jumped on you there.
Is that better?
No.
Have Eric fix it.
There it is.
All right.
The community-based services with a max ratio of 1 to 3, that would be a programmatic shift from current, where many community-based programs are 1 to 4, 1 to 5. So is that a policy shift proposed to limit that?
I suppose it could be defined that way, yes. I mean, the assumption in the rate models is that you would not be able to build a community-based rate at a ratio any larger than 1 to 3.
Golden Gate. Did I just hear you say that a day program that mixed site-based and community-based activities during the day would then be authorized for a split number of hours between the 2 rates?
So that goes to the point that I tried to make earlier this morning. I don't know precisely how the authorization is going to work, and I gave 2 examples of how other states have done it. So you have states who will authorize a specific number of center-based hours and a specific number of community-based hours, and then what oftentimes happens is you have to true up at the end of the year. If you assumed a 50-50 split and it turns out to be 52-48, you might have to go in, revise an authorization to take one down to 48 and take the other back up to 52. There are other states who have a more global authorization for day programs, and a dollar amount is authorized, and all claims that are based upon a valid rate, a debit against that global authorization. So rather than authorizing 1,500 or 700 hours of center-based and 700 hours of community-based, 1,400 hours are authorized, and billing under either of those service codes or subcodes would debit against that 1,400 hour limit or the dollar limit, depending upon how the authorization is set up. Again, the second is certainly more flexible, but it's going to be dependent upon what the systems are able to accommodate.
And do you make a recommendation will you be making a recommendation in the report in this area?
I don't think I'll include a recommendation on that particular regard. I mean, I'm not embarrassed to say my preference is to have a global authorization, but if the MMIS can't accommodate it, the MMIS can't accommodate it. We have to work with what we have, right?
Thanks.
There's a question there.
Sylvia Yin from Friends of Children Special. So regarding the center-based services and community-based services, it will be under one service code, but with the subcode?
So those specific details have been yet to be worked out. I mean, there's the possibility that you would have 6 different service codes, right? Because you have center-based, community-based, medical, behavioral, and other. Or it could be one service code with 6 different subcodes, and actually it would be more extensive than actual different subcodes for each of the ratios. Or there could be one service code for medical programs, one for behavioral programs, one for other. I don't know ultimately how all that shakes out, but there will need to be a unique code and or subcode combination for each of the rates that we included in our rate model packet.
As I addressed with you during the break, currently the 510 rate, daily rate just roughly is about $60 per day. Versus 055, if you times 6 hours a day, the rate is about $90. Plus there's a transportation component which is $13 a day. So it's a huge difference from 103 per day for a community-based program versus center-based program, which is licensed program. It's a lot of cost there. And the rate is only $60. So I want to know what the model is going to be like in the future.
Well, I don't remember that specific number off the top of my head, but it is certainly in that rate model packet. We'll walk through at least one example, but you'll need to pick out the example that corresponds to your staffing ratio. It's on an hourly basis, so you'd want to do the same math that you talked about, which is assuming 6 hours per day, and then line that up with what you're currently earning for your 2 programs.
So my last question is, for this model, would that be the transportation component still be included for the community-based services?
Really good question. So transportation to and from the program is not part of the rate.
Not to and from, during the program operation time.
So in-program transportation is assumed to be part of these rates.
Thank you.
Sure.
Is it working?
It is.
All right.
You're a pro.
I'm a pro. Ah. So my question, well, it's more of a comment about, we have a community integration training program, 055, with a component to serve people who are medically fragile. What I have found when using hiring certified nursing assistants is the culture that develops is more of a caregiving, take care of people, little hospital kind of culture. And so I have a mix of CNAs and people who come from more of a DSP background, which helps with the community integration and the understanding of person-centered services, et cetera, et cetera. I like the extra training that certified nursing assistants get for this population, but to have only CNAs would go against the mission of our day program. And it wouldn't be very person-centered, which we have a grant for the HCBS, which we're trying to move from a culture of caregiving to a more person-centered perspective. So I'm not saying CNAs aren't person-centered. They're coming from a caregiving perspective, which can be non-person-centered. And so I just want to make that comment.
Sure, and I appreciate that. And so I assume that we'll be hearing that comment again through this public comment process. And what I would encourage is that if there's additional training that you think the if it's not a CNA, what differentiates the staff providing a medically focused service from those who are providing a non-medically focused service? Because again, we want something that allows us to hang our proverbial hat to say, what's the basis for having a differentiated wage assumption?
We'll say for Futures Explore, just to follow up, we look at what's called restricted healthcare conditions. And so people are trained specifically on G-tubes, J-tubes, and those specific areas, but they're DSPs otherwise. So it's very narrow bandwidth. So again, they come in with the philosophy of these folks should be and can do a lot more than a true medical model. I'd say it's more of a medical model than a caregiving model, because that's where CNAs typically are working in much more that sort of environment. We're still trying to encourage folks to be in the community. So I would agree we need to somehow play with that anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah, Marty Yamamoto, CD Can. On this rate model here, And I was told this before, but I just want to make sure, this assumes full compliance with the home and community-based services final rule.
So,
And you referred to other states where this has been applied, and do you know if those other states have approved HCBS plans from CMS? Because obviously the goal is that we want to transition to full compliance.
So the rates by themselves are intended to facilitate more community access. We have higher rates for services delivered in the community than delivered at the center, which is an element, obviously, of compliance with HCBS, but it's not the only element, and it's also not the case that any center-based services are not going to be HCBS compliant. So it's hard for me to say it's not a definitive statement that these are or are not compliant. You can certainly operate programs in compliance with the HCBS rule under these rate models, though.
And then, also, someone else alluded to this. When there are going to be potentially policy changes or required changes in state law, will the report that will be submitted to the legislature, will it note that this would require a change in state law or state policy?
What we're currently envisioning is a level of detail similar to what you see in this PowerPoint presentation. So it's certainly not going to be citing all the individual statutes and regulations, but it is going to be talking about the exact sorts of things that you see in this presentation, that we've built this rate model with these assumptions, with the presumption, therefore, being that it's going to require, in some cases, a change to a statute or a regulation.
Hi, Nancy Chance. I just had a quick question. Do these assume that in the site-based, or I guess did you call it site-based, that the center-based, that those programs are going to be licensed? Somebody else did mention it, but that there is a cost that goes along with that. So was that factored in, or were you assuming that they don't necessarily have to be licensed?
We're not proposing changes so much to the current licensing requirements. So I'm not sure that I'm entirely.
Well, I think that so some center-based programs serve people that don't necessarily need a license. However, it has been a policy that anything that's center-based has to have community care licensing. And it costs money, and so I would think that needs to be something factored in the rate. That's really what my question is.
So there's not a specific factor related to licensing costs, but when we, again, did the provider survey, we included licensing costs as a specific category of administrative expenses, and we spoke at some length yesterday about the admin that's built into the rate models and how that was derived.
Michelle Ramirez. A question from the community. Once you to clarify the transportation coverage in this model again, just to reiterate what you had said earlier?
Sure. So for the day program model overall, the transportation to and from the program, so going from the person's residence to the program, from the program to the residence at the beginning and end of the day respectively, is outside of the proposed rates. That would be billed separately as transportation. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The in-program transportation, transporting people around the community as part of their day program, is built into the rate models. And built into the community-based rate model specifically. There's not a transportation built into the center-based services for obvious reasons. So we wanted to walk through a couple of the rate models. For those following along, we're going to be starting on page 1016 of the rate model packet. There we go. So this rate model is for day program delivered at a center location at a 1:6 ratio. There's going to be a different rate model for each of the individual ratios, right? There's a rate model for 1 to 10, 1 to 9, all the way down to 1 to 3. And on the community-based side, there's two rate models, 1 to 3 and 1 to 2. And then for 1016. Okay, and then further, this reflects the non-medical, non-behavioral program. So what you see that we start with is the same $14.89 wage assumption we have in the base rate model. the same buildup of benefit costs with the workers' compensation rate that varies a little bit based upon what you saw for residential and individual and personalized supports. We have the productivity adjustments, and then importantly, we get down to the staffing ratio. So again, this is the 1-to-6 rate model. So obviously 6 is what is input there. And then to the question that was brought up earlier, we are assuming a 90% attendance rate. So that means what we're effectively funding is 1 staff person for every 5.4 individuals, although the requirement's only 1-to-6 because people are occasionally going to be absent. And that 90% factor is driven primarily or entirely on provider survey results. I think this is perhaps a couple of points lower than what was reported to us on average, but we kind of rounded down in this case to 90%. The next section just relates to the approach in which we amortize the facility costs. So we talk about the number really of hours of attendance that someone has over the course of a year because we need to spread that fixed facility cost over some basis. Then looking at the facility costs, the assumptions that we make are the number of square feet per participant and the cost per square foot. So we're assuming 50 square feet of program space per participant. And again, we oftentimes get into a conversation about, well, that doesn't include the lobbies and the hallways and the bathrooms. And the answer to that question is that's true. What we're referring to here is the program space. The other expenses are part of the administrative or operations expenses, just like they are for all the other services that are similarly going to have lobbies and bathrooms and hallways. And so we're funding the square footage at $15 per square foot, which gives us a total cost per participant on an annualized basis of $750, and then we divide that by the number of hours of attendance that we saw in the preceding section of the rate model. From here, we add supervision using the same wage assumptions and span of control that we talked about throughout the day. We add program operations according to that rule we talked about in the PowerPoint earlier yesterday, and then the 12% for administration. And that, in this particular case, gives us a rate on a per person basis of $750 per hour for that 1-to-6 service.
Question here. Jordan Lindsay, and this is more of a comment, and I've brought it up before, but in considering the attendance rate, the DSP still has to show up to work. So does the supervisor, so does the administration. So discounting, I don't think reflects the costs of providing the service still. And I'm assuming there'll probably be additional comments during the comment period. Because I don't think, if I remember, you said that was not incorporated into the rate model.
No, what I was referring to earlier was in the section that we were talking about was the personal support services. In day program, that attendance rate is very much driving cost. So we recognize that that staff person is going to be there regardless whether or not 6 people show up or 5 people show up. So based upon a 90% attendance factor, we're paying for 1 staff for every 5.4 individuals to account for the fact that there's going to be absences. So the rate's higher than it otherwise would be to account for those absences.
So the 90% is, if I'm reading the, please just correct me if I'm reading it wrong. I'm reading the rate model that the 90% is discounting the adjusted weighted of 540 down to 458. So without the 90% adjustment cost, the rate would eventually...
You're comparing people to dollars. So the 5.4 is the number of individuals per direct support worker. That's what we're using to divide into the cost that's up above for the wages and benefits.
So the 90% is applied to, I get it. Okay. The staff and workshop. I still may have a question about it, but I'm...
Well, I have a follow-up to Jordan's question. I'm wondering why the 90% isn't taken into account for the hours per year of attendance when you then go in to figure out the facility costs?
It is taken into account. That's why we did it on the days rather than the hours, because we're assuming that people, when they're, again, we could do it either way, but we did 225 days of attendance rather than 250 days at an average of 5.4 hours, whatever that would come out to be.
Looking at the, I'm sorry, looking at the program operations costs, it looks like there's an assumed daily program operation cost of $20 And then program operations cost per billable hour of 69 cents, and I'm not sure what the math was to get us from $20 to 69 cents.
So it's taking a look both at the number of staff hours, but also the number of individuals for whom that's being billed, because this is a rate on a per person basis. So one thing that we can certainly do to make that clear is it's program operations cost per participant per billable hour. But that's what the step down is.
And the daily program operations cost of $20, is that per participant?
Per direct care worker, which is why it gets stepped down
Got it.
for the number of participants in the program.
Jordan, Lindsay, one more question. You may have answered before, I apologize. Is supervisor hourly wage? Where's that assumption coming from again?
It's the
Is that
wage.
straight through?
Pardon?
Sorry, go ahead.
It's from the BLS data, and there's a specific wage classification for, and don't quote me on this, but it's first line supervisors in human services field or something along those lines. So that is certainly reported in Appendix B what the specific SOC is and the name of that, but it's a specific occupation that is for the human services field, and it is for the first line supervisor. So this is one of those examples where we had a good fit from the BLS data where we didn't have to do any sort of weighting. There was an occupation that represented the supervisory responsibilities.
Does the curriculum development build into that can be, count for the hours that staff have to prepare on a weekly basis?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Curriculum preparation.
Yeah, so we have a line item that's unique to day programs. It's called program preparation or setup and cleanup, and that would include that sort of function.
And you were staff training 0.67. That's the same as other training that you were thinking.
That's the 35 hours per year. That's what it works out to on a weekly basis. Absolutely. And so we'll just roll to the next model, which is going to be pretty similar to what we just saw, but this is the community-based version, again, of the non-medical, non-behavioral, and this is at a 1-to-3 staffing ratio. So same wage assumption, same benefit package, productivity is going to be largely similar. We have that 1-to-3 ratio, adjusted for a 90% attendance factor, takes the number of participants per staff person down, which increases the cost per person. We have attendance assumptions. In this case, we have mileage. Again, to reiterate the point that was raised, a question that was raised a moment ago, this is for the in-program transportation, not to and from. That would be billed separately on a trip basis, which we'll get back to. This is for the purpose of transporting individuals in the community as part of their program. I'm sorry, thank you, Jim. This is page 1051. And then the next component, at first blush, seems a little counterintuitive, but we have a facility cost in the community-based rates. And I think at least in some of the meetings we had with the rates work group, I talked about our philosophy behind doing that. And the idea is, although there are some community-only programs that exist, most programs are going to have both a center-based component and a community-based component. And so just because you've taken someone out into the community doesn't mean that you're not still paying your mortgage and paying to keep the lights on. So with the expectation that folks are getting a mix of services, we want to make sure that we're fully paying for the cost of your facility. If we only included this in the facility-based rates, for every hour of community-based services, you'd be losing revenue to pay for that facility-based cost. So by including the facility component in both the center-based rates and the community-based rate, we're making sure that, at least based upon our assumptions, you're being fully compensated for that facility expense.
So, well, so that's assuming that you're gonna have mixed use, so to speak, a little bit. So you're having, someone could be half day on-site, half day in a community. Is that sort of how you got to that? Or is it one where you could have, and especially in rural areas, you may have a small location where it's more of a hub where people come into, figure out who's going where, and then they go back out and spend most of their day in the community, but you still have a place where people come to. Don't know if there's a difference between those two.
Well, so we had some conversations about that very topic. So to the first part of your question, we are working under the assumption that most programs are going to have both components. But the beauty of doing the rates in this manner is it really doesn't matter. If you do 100% of the time in the center, you're going to get paid for your community, for your facility. If you do 50-50, you're going to get paid for your facility. So that's why we do it this way, because it doesn't matter what the split is between center versus community services. So to your point about the hub, we had that conversation because arguably our 50 square feet per person is way too generous for some of those hub programs that I've had conversations about. So if they really are operating as a home base, you probably have a pretty small location. We're paying 50 square feet for every participant, but you might have a single location out of which services are being delivered to 100 individuals. So I certainly think this accommodates that model, and if anything, I think it is generous for that model of service delivery.
Thanks, that would be helpful. The other question was, I know we talked about, especially in the community, for those of us who happen to have more urban settings, public transit as a major option or program access. So it's not necessarily people getting into cars and driving, but encouraging our folks to take public transit as a means to increase their skills overall. I know that was probably tougher data to get, because I think we added that in pretty late to the rate request. Did you look at that kind of data? I mean, is that somehow factored in? Would you assume that it's replaced by the mileage calc?
So, because the way we ultimately decided to go with transportation is handling it outside of, or are you talking about like in-program transportation?
In-program transportation, where people are going, like, I'm going to go into the community, I'm going to go catch the bus and go to the gym.
So my first thought was that you were talking about the to and from, and I was going to answer on that basis. So, no, we gave some thought, but because we kind of landed on the primary way that people are going to be transported is going to be driven by the provider rather than relying upon public transportation. And we didn't want to build different rate models that turn on that specific assumption. We went with the more traditional, the day program provider will be using sedans or vans to transport people around the community.
On that same question on mileage, did the categories still apply in the day programs? Because it looks like Alta was a higher category, but yet the mileage is lower on this chart. On the base rate. I think they were category C.
Yeah, we'll have to go back and you are correct. So something is near somewhere, and we'll figure out what that specific area is.
Barry Jardine, CDSA. I'm wondering, looking at the attendance rate, the 90% that was calculated was based largely on daily billing for day programs. When you get into hourly billing, you know, if transportation's arriving late to a program, there's a lot of documentation of, you know, specific arrival times, like almost like time cards for participants in program. So I'm not sure that 90% is going to hold up as well once you get into an hourly billing kind of model. And then I guess this follow-up to that is, how specific and how detailed? Is it going to be like 10th of an hour sort of stuff in terms of billing? Is it 15 minutes? What does the model look like?
So to the first part of the question, understand the point, that's fair, and that's something that folks think ought to be reconsidered. We're welcoming feedback, as I've said a couple times, on any and all of the assumptions. So I understand the point that you're raising. The second answer to your question is, this is the rate model, so it's based upon an hourly billing. So it would not be done in 15-minute increments. The state would have to make a determination about what the billing rules are, and you probably know that ordinarily it's, you know, 31 minutes rounds up to an hour, below 30 minutes rounds down to the previous hour. But at this point, we're not envisioning doing quarter-hour units, we're envisioning hourly units.
Okay. It just seems to me like some of the administration of that, I mean, I think it's already been commented on, it's going to be much more intensive when you get into this sort of a model versus what we had for daily.
Hard to argue that it's going to be more difficult, going to be more labor intensive to bill for hours than days, and based upon where the services are being delivered. Do not dispute those points.
Eric Chandler, UCP. One point to the transportation, if you're billing per hour, clients leaving early for illness, for other issues, obviously that would be deducted from what you're billing. But the point to transportation, especially for these programs, it's not uncommon that you have folks staying later. So currently we're limited to billing only the 6-hour day for folks that were scheduled. So that would be something that you'd want to, if you're making to an hourly billing, I'd encourage folks to consider opening that up so that it's actual time, so that folks can be compensated when they're caring for folks that maybe are staying in the program because somebody's late to picking them up. That could be significant.
Thank you. So, much like residential, there's going to be quite a few pages of day program rates because of 3 different program types, 2 different service settings, and a lot of different staffing ratios. So this is going to be another chunk of that rate model packet. But we'll move back to the PowerPoint presentation. And that will be going to page 100. And this is for the in-home day program, which from a rate modeling perspective looks remarkably like the services we started talking about here this morning, the personal supports and training services, because we're providing a direct support professional in someone's home, ordinarily on a one-to-one or sometimes on a group basis. So from a rate model perspective, this is actually going to look much more like an independent living service or a personal assistance service than it is going to look like the day program models. So hourly billing here with rates that vary based upon geography, based upon the staffing ratio, again, assuming up to 1 to 3, and then the non-English stipend being available as well.
Hi, Nancy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Nancy Chance. When you say geography, are you just talking geography in terms of regional center? So you're not talking geography within the regional center?
That's correct. And so I addressed that yesterday, but it bears repeating that in the interest of some degree of administrative simplicity, we are proposing that rates that vary at the regional center level, but not within the regional center. And folks yesterday and in previous meetings have brought up how that could vary within a regional center based upon different travel requirements, based upon different pockets of higher or lower wage areas. Certainly understand all those points, but here, as it currently stands, it's the rates are going to be uniform across a regional center.
So, does this particular category include residential homes, community care residential homes?
That's my understanding. This is the service code under which those specific services are being delivered, I think, in large measure.
So earlier, 109 code wasn't mentioned, but that's what our in-home day programs are under, so maybe that's just a correction.
Yeah, well, and that's one of those areas where we probably need to have a conversation about where it's appropriate to place that particular service. Because again, we want to have a service tying to a specific service code, not being billed under 091 in some cases and 109 in other cases.
Right, it just isn't clear in the package.
That's fair, I appreciate that.
I don't recall, does this also have a medical component to it? Because many of the folks we support in this have relatively significant medical, although they get a lot of that medical support in the home. This model really developed that the Ag News closure was a big chunk of it, and so we had folks who were on ventilators and other things that we couldn't serve in a community-based licensed facility. You needed, so we did in-home programming for that. So there's some medical piece to it, but I mean, or is this just a single?
So as it stands, there is not a variant for that program type like there is for the community-based day programs. Part of the thought process behind that, though, is if we're delivering services with, say, a home health aid, there's already different rates, not part of our scope of work, but part of the, under the schedule maximum allowances to pay for a home health aid. So the thought was, do we need something different, or can we rely upon those already existing service codes? And right now, we conclude that we rely upon those other service codes.
Okay, and that would make sense. We typically are using relatively traditional direct service professionals to provide those services in the home, because in those with significant medical needs, they have the nursing staff on site, and the reason they don't leave very often is they need to have a 24/7 nursing care.
Yeah,
So
so,
that's,
and so then I would kind of repeat the suggestion I made earlier. If folks think that is a necessity where it's a DSP with a higher wage to provide someone with medical or behavioral needs rather than our CNA assumption, I would just be interested in specific feedback about what you think those qualifications look like to differentiate why we're going to pay for a higher rate in that case based upon the DSP's background, experience, or education.
gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Let's start with
I apologize if you've already answered this, but the non-English stipend, does that follow the person receiving services, or does that follow the agencies? The $100 per person receiving services?
Well, so it's a really good question, and I obviously didn't do a great job of explaining it. So it really has two components. It's the individual must need it, so they are non-English speaking, and the direct care worker who's providing the service must be able to communicate to them in their language. So you have to have both of those elements. Where I feel like I might not have done a good enough job explaining it is it's not a $100 lump sum payment that's made. That $100 is built into the rate model. And so the way that works out is to 58 cents per hour is the math behind it. $100 divided by approximately 160-hour work month, 58 cents per hour. So then when you're looking at, say, in-home day program, the rate, and this is not the actual rate, but the rate would be $30. The rate for the non-English stipend would be $30 plus 58 cents, and then there's a little bit obviously added on for employee benefits, workers' comp, and FICA and the like. So it would come out to like $30.75. So that's what the rate that you would bill. And so in that regard, I would say that it follows the individual.
So even with like a 1-to-3, 1-to-6 ratio, if you have 3 people that speak non-English and you have a staff, you would get it spread across those 3.
So in that case, yes, that's effectively what would be happening. So again, we're a little bit, the rate model is more sophisticated than this, because I said earlier that I don't believe in dividing by 3 to come up with the rate. But let's say that's what we did. So if the rate was $30.75, you'd be billing each of those 3 people at $10.25, and that 25 cents would be stacked at the 75 cent total. Yes, sir.
So further on Will's comment, the 109 programs I was referring to are in fact medical and probably couldn't be easily incorporated without factoring in, a higher level than a CNA, LVN or nurse. And
well,
it would seem like a reasonable distinction between, you've made it in some other areas where you have a community or facility-based program, some medical, some behavioral, and some legal. Just a thought, because I like the idea of all-day programs coming together under the same umbrella, and but you need to be able to at least accommodate that kind of a variant rather than just compressing them all into it's just a DSP times an hourly rate, fracked up for all the benefits and stuff.
So just so that I'm clear on the point, you talked about an LVN or an RN. Is that the staff that's actually delivering some of these 109 services?
Yeah, so in an RSFIN home, whether it's in the middle of the night or during the day, there always has to be a licensed staff. So if it happens to be an in-home day program, then there would have to be a licensed staff during the day hours.
I appreciate that. What I'm not quite following is providing the care or providing some sort of oversight for those staff who are providing the care?
No, care.
Okay. So in that case, one of the things that was specifically excluded from our scope was setting rates for nursing services. That's outside of DDS's purview. That's obviously Medi-Cal's responsibility. So the kind of default position would be in that circumstance, rather than billing under one of these service codes, we bill under the service code that corresponds to a registered nurse or an LVN. That falls under the schedule of maximum allowances.
Or it could just stay the way it is, which is the annual contract under Service Code 109.
I'm going to go with 2 unrelated questions as well. One, does the non-English stipend also apply to ASL interpretation? or staff?
Absolutely.
Okay. And the second one was when you did the, and it goes, I'm sorry, I'm going back also, in the productivity, day programs have historically in the state of California for the last 50 years been 30 hours a week. So how do we have staff billable for 32 hours a week when there's only 30 hours that we bill now?
Because it's been our experience that programs are typically operating for longer than 6 hours because people show up and depart at different times. So that direct care worker might be providing 32 hours of direct care because they're working between 8 a.m. and 3:30 p.m., which is a 7.5 hour day. No individual is there for more than 6 hours, but the direct care worker is there for a longer period of time.
So there's something reflecting the reality of transportation nuances where people can arrive either an hour or two before and leave an hour or two after the program is supposed to start.
Well, transportation or preference, I mean, or sometimes it's a matter of preference too.
I'm going to go with 75% is transportation related, and yes, there are definitely people who choose to come in late and leave late, but more often than not, it's related to getting people to and from where they are living.
PDF. So for the center-based 1-to-6 ratio, your daily hourly rate is 7.49.
Correct.
And the community base is 20.81 for 1-to-3 ratio.
I don't remember that number, but that sounds right to me.
Yeah. So, I mean, for the center base, like extremely low. If you times 6 hours per day, that's only come with $44 per day.
I think it's less than that.
Yeah, it's 44.94.
Oh, okay, so the...
I mean, this is a tremendous difference. That's almost $80 difference per day per client.
What is 1-to-6? Are you comparing to a 1-to-6 ratio? Because obviously the 1-to-5 ratio, the rate for 1-to-5 would be higher, 1-to-4 would be higher.
But still, I mean, this is tremendous hurt.
Well, I'm sorry, I thought you were comparing it to an existing rate. Were you comparing the center-based rate to the community-based rate?
Yeah, just based on...
Oh, so those can't be, you have to compare the 1-to-3 to the 1-to-3. So, yeah, and I don't have, we did an excerpt so we could navigate through our file, so I can't pull that up on my screen. But you would need to go to the page that has the 1-to-3 center-based rate in order to do an apples-to-apples comparison. You can't compare 1-to-6 to 1-to-3. So, but by design, the rate for center-based services is going to be less than the rate for community-based services, even at the 1-to-3 ratio. But it's not going to be anywhere near the difference that you just mentioned.
Stephen, I just want to return to your answer to Will's question about the 32-hour paid staff and 30 hours of program time. And I get some people come early and some people leave late, but all the people don't come early and all the people don't leave late. So pretend half came early and then they left early, another half came late and left late. You'd still only be able to bill for half the people in the early time and half the people in the late time. So you couldn't have all of your staff billing 32 hours because you don't have enough people in the program. So it doesn't quite work out the way you described it. I mean, you described it previously as it's a percentage and you're working off the percentages, but 32, you couldn't bill all your staff 32 hours when people are only there 30 hours, even if some come early and some stay late.
So I understand, and I mean, I guess and partly that can be driven sometimes by the size of the program. I mean, I've seen very large programs where there's staggering start times of staff, particularly because of the different ratios for center-based versus community-based services, where you have people working different shifts during the day, coming and going at different times. So I mean, I'm not arguing the point, and it's something that we're certainly willing to continue to consider.
Well, maybe we'll just write it out and sort of scope it out, because I don't think you can bill all your staff more than the program's open. Even though on an individual level, one staff could bill for 32 hours in a week, but another staff is going to have to bill for less to make up for it.
Right about that, we can talk from there. So I'm moving past day programs and on to individual supported employment. So as I mentioned at the top of this portion of the presentation right after lunch, we're proposing that that service be bifurcated between job development activities and job coaching activities. We would propose to eliminate the requirement that providers must be nonprofits, as I alluded to earlier. And then we would have hourly billing units with rates that vary based upon geography or regional center, as well as the non-English stipend being available in these particular cases. The other point that we would emphasize is on the job development side, we propose a limitation of 40 hours per year for job development activities.
It's Will. So job development limited to 40 hours per year. Job development is typically relatively intense and often includes areas such as discovery and exploration, which, you know, on average nationally is going to run between 30 and 100 hours. So it seems like a year might be too long. Maybe a shorter time frame would be more authorized than that. Would make more sense related to the specifics of helping someone, you know, seek and gain a job in that. A year in job development seems like they're still doing a lot of skill development or other things that aren't necessarily purely job development. If someone's really, I want a job and let's go find them, especially today, they can get a job tomorrow. So it seems like a long time frame.
Okay.
Just clarify.
That starts with a rate model that we were planning to go through. It's relatively quick. I think I've beaten the microphone.
You better start.
While we wait for Stephen, I'll give you a question. So, not that I've read through all 2,000 pages, I've gotten to page 3. Did tailored day services somehow now get buried into some other service category consolidation because it was, you know, our own specialized, nuanced deal out there? So is that now somehow grabbed somewhere in a different category, or are you simply assuming the new array of services you could do what essentially is tailored day services in one of those other models?
That's the hope, and that comes back to the one of the points that I raised first thing yesterday morning in terms of what we want to hear from folks. Obviously, we're happy to talk about the wage assumptions or any other assumptions in the rate models, but at least as important to us is telling us whether or not we've missed anything. So when we've had a conversation about tailored day, we thought that most of what's being done, or all that's what's being done, could be subsumed under what it is we're proposing. But if there's something that doesn't fit into these categories, that's absolutely the type of feedback that we want to receive over the next couple of weeks. So again, 2 rate models to walk through: job development and job coaching. I actually want to spend a lot of time talking through these because from a structural perspective, it's very similar to many of the rates that we've already taken a look at. So a couple things that you point out. For job development, we have a substantially higher wage than what you saw for, say, DSP. So almost $25 an hour, which comes out to about $50,000 per year based upon the expectation these folks are going to be kind of equivalent to like a rehab counselor type of position. The other thing that we add to this particular...
What page are you on?
Thank you. I am on page 1,254. The other thing that we add to this rate that's unique to this specific service is the networking and general development activity. So we wanted to differentiate here. Of course, the service in and of itself is job development, but that's billed when you're working on behalf of a specific individual. Oftentimes, we're expecting these folks to be building their own network of businesses, extolling the virtues of hiring people with disabilities, et cetera. So we wanted to make sure we built some time into the rate model to accommodate them to do those generalized activities that they cannot bill for if it's not on behalf of a specific individual. It's providing information about, again, employing people with disabilities and having slots open for when you have an individual interested in getting a job. Outside of that, though, I think from a rate model perspective, this is relatively vanilla, so I don't have a whole lot of other observations to add.
This will, it's roughly 10% of the 40 hours, give or take a little more than 10%, for networking general development activities. Thinking back to most of our staff are out there, they're probably spending, I'm gonna guess in the 20-25% range versus 10. So I mean, that could be another one that we have a comment on. And then back to, I guess, the tailored day service, part of that was we could negotiate hourly rates that would be significantly higher than are currently subsumed in any of the, at least the rates I've seen so far on the 1 to 2, 1 to 3 combinations, which wouldn't support those activities. So I guess we'll have to take a look at that and comment related to whether or not TDS needs to be its own 1-to-1 kind of rate.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, and perhaps goes almost without saying, but the premise of the underlying rate study in a lot of regards is to get away from a lot of those negotiated rates. So the question becomes is what was the basis for those negotiations? And if it's something that warrants much higher wage, like I said before about these medical programs, what's the basis for having a higher wage assumption or underlying rates? And certainly encourage people to be as specific as possible in terms of what you think justifies a higher rate for a given service modality.
This is Wendy Forgas, and I just had a question in regards to one. I love to see that job development is under DDS, and that it could be potentially funded through this system because the majority of what my organization does is through DOR. My other question is in regards to the billable hour. Do we know if that's face-to-face direct service to the consumer? Or is that hours that a job developer is doing without being right next to face-to-face or over the phone with the individual?
Really good question, and we're certainly not specific here. I will tell you for my part, though, the thought is for a service like this would also include some of the on behalf of type of activities if it's dedicated to a specific individual.
Very quick question, did you consider CIE payments?
The incentive payments that are currently being offered. So in terms of whether or not we consider them, we're not proposing any changes to them, I guess is the short answer. And so then we'll go down to the job coaching rate model, where you'll see the wage assumption is quite a bit more modest than we had on the job development. I think fairly in line with what we saw in the provider survey, however. Outside of that, again, the moving pieces of this are relatively comparable to what we've already seen for other services, so I don't have a whole lot to point out on this. Again, it's a one-to-one service for the most part, so wages, benefits, productivity, mileage, operations, and administration, and we're largely done. Thank you. I have it in front of me. That's page 1261.
So the base rate is less than we're currently being paid for job coaching, individual placement, support employment, and we're having people leave the system. So clearly we have an issue in Houston in this rate. And the other one is looking at travel time between individuals. Again, this is, to go back to the other model, our folks can see 4 to 6 people a day traveling between them. So out of a 40-hour week, only an hour, 40 minutes driving. As Carol and I talked about it, depending on when you have to go from Lafayette to Antioch, that could be a 15-minute drive or a 3-hour drive. So that kind of factor would be something we really want to look at. And also, I mean, that rate says that we're really, I mean, from a political standpoint, I would say we're not an employment first state. That rate is where we've been forever and doesn't say we really want to do that.
appreciate the feedback, of course. The idea, though, is as part of the comment process, rather than saying, we don't like the rate, and I know you'll be more detailed in this, but for the benefit of the entire group, it's to say, what specific assumptions do you think are ought to be subject to reconsideration? And in fairness, you point some out, like mileage and the like as well, so that's the sort of feedback that's more actionable rather than just saying that we think the rate's too low.
I'll do a follow-up.
If I count to three, like I tell everybody else. So the 1620 hourly wage, so there's obviously a different mix in the BLS data as far as that, and that's, I assume, it identified in one of the appendices.
Absolutely, yeah. It's
Page 7042.
not that high, but it is somewhere in Appendix B.
Thank you.
Moving back to the PowerPoint.
Stephen, just before you leave employment completely. This is Eric Golgate. I'm sorry if I missed this. Did you say that you were recommending in the report the 40-hour limit on job development hours?
Yes.
And did you say what was the calculation to come up with that limit?
We conducted an inventory of what state limitations are. So not all states place limitation, and most states don't have a specific job development service. It's just like it is currently in California, where it's allowable activity under a supported employment service. But for those states who specifically allow job development as a standalone trackable service, many of them include an annual billing cap. And the range of that, certainly there's folks on either end of the spectrum, but the range is typically between 40 and 80 hours.
80 seems closer to me in terms of even 5-10 years ago in terms of the cost of job development. But the other thing I wanted to throw out here was, and I know maybe you have information from other states, is that I know in the job coaching, but I'm not sure in the job development, if there's an incentive to serve people with more complicated and challenging disabilities so that you would either have a higher cap or a higher rate if you were able to place folks who are traditionally more difficult to kind of construct a job for.
So absolutely have some experience in that particular area. Like your neighbors to the north in Oregon, when we built job development rates there, we have 3 different tiers with a rate, and it's a milestone payment rather than an hourly reimbursement, but that milestone goes up progressively as the level of need increases. For services here outside of structures that already exist around things like the CCFs and the FHA, because you don't have a standardized approach to assessing individuals, we're not proposing any sort of tiered rates. That's not to say that it's not something that ought to be contemplated, but we don't have anything to say who is a level 1 or a tier 1 or level 2 or a tier 2.
That's fair, thanks.
But I mean, again, this is something that I know is near and dear to a lot of people's hearts, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about employment over the years, but you're absolutely right. The data shows when you align it in states that have assessment instruments of who's working, it's very strongly concentrated in the folks with the least substantial needs. We see very few folks with more significant needs in employment across the country.
Thank you.
Eric with UCB, just before we leave the day employment and these individualized services, when I'm looking at these 4 categories, direct staff hourly wage, travel time between individuals, record keeping, reporting, and training, those 4 categories across services as different as PA, respite, ILS, SLS, DSPs, and supported employment. There's very little variation there, and there's very little variation for like the wages. It's almost about 40 cents between all of those. So back to Will's point, I think we're losing some of the differentiating between the class of workers as they're going into higher, more skilled positions within the industry. And I think that's part of what we can give some comment to, because I think it's in those 4 categories that I mentioned: wages, travel time, record keeping, reporting, and training, where there's differences between, say, a training for a restaurant worker and a job coach. So I think that may be an area that we can focus on.
Thank you.
It appears that under individual job coaching, there isn't a DSP 1, 2, and 3 rates in the model. It says non-applicable.
That's correct. Right now, there's not the tiered DSPs that apply to that.
And why wouldn't there be?
So those are largely limited to the services that we assume a DSP is delivering. So similarly, we don't have a tier DSPs for the personal assistant service. There's certainly, again, not to make your argument for you, I understand the point that you're raising. There's potentially some value to reconsidering that as it relates to job coach, because it's not necessarily part of the DSP framework or the way we've built up the rate models. That's the rambling answer, I suppose. And so before I moved on, I did want to point something else out to make sure folks do not lose sight of it, because I think you might have an opinion or two on this. As part of the rate model, we would say that you would no longer be billing for travel time. So that's consistent with the premise for most of our other services. And someone brought up a question on a different service on that topic earlier today, so I wanted to make sure that was, although it's in writing, I wanted to make sure I said it aloud so that nothing was missed. So that takes us to group supported employment. Again, a couple of similar items as we saw on the individual side. The elimination of the requirement that providers must be nonprofits. We would eliminate the billing for travel time. And then for rate variance, we would have the geography-based adjustments. We have group sizes that range from 1 to 2 to 1 to 8, which is what's currently allowed. And then programs would be their vendor for a specific ratio. And the non-English stipend would also apply to group supported employment.
I wasn't actually listening to the type of group support. In group support, I can job coach, I just can't follow instructions. Currently, so this would be an area where we'd have to change law, because currently groups are 1 to 3. A group of 1 to 2 does not exist in the state of California in group support appointments. Well, it does exist in reality, but it doesn't exist in how it's supposed to be operationalized. So that would be one of those things that would be highlighted that would need a change in legislation, regulation, or whatever. It would be one of those that would have to be taken a look at.
Thank you. And then I did want to click over to the group supported employment model just to highlight one specific issue. And before Jim gets to me, that's going to be page 1226 of the PDF. So what you see here is going to look very familiar to what you saw on the community-based day programs. Wages, benefits, productivity, a staffing ratio, adjusted by that attendance factor. What I wanted to point out is, as you scroll down, is that we did not include any assumptions related to facility costs, and that was done by design. The idea here is that in a group-supported employment environment, we're paying for the cost of supervision, but as a money-making enterprise, the cost of your facilities and your supplies and the like ought to be covered by whatever contracts you have, rather than paid for through DDS. The regional center system would be paying for the supervision and training of the individuals, but not for the operating expenses of the business. So that's why we specifically omit a facility cost or supply cost.
Well, group support employment is typically done at other locations or outside of where people are operating, but there's often it's still a small facility, similar to a community-based day program where job coaches go back to do record keeping and reporting and that. So
for that type of space, we include as part of the administrative expense, just like it is for any other service.
Again, okay, goes back to our debate a year and a half ago about program versus admin in the state of California. So okay.
And I appreciate your point about community-based. So again, to broaden my point, the same thing would be true. So, you know, I've had these conversations where perhaps it's a thrift store that a provider operates and employs people with disabilities, and they say, why isn't the cost of the rent and the mortgage and the utilities of this thrift store included in the rate? Same thing is true if we're doing, say, a landscaping or janitorial crew. Why don't you include the cost of the shovels and the cleaning supplies? And the idea is that that ought to be included in the contract with the building owners for whom you're delivering that service.
Can you hear me? Okay. Sorry, Wendy Farkas here again. I just had two questions. So for group-supported employment, right now, some groups are receiving subminimum wage, is 14C. And so that is one of the ways that we're able to become competitive in our contract negotiations. And so I just wanted to state that so that there's some acknowledgement to that when we're talking about this, that we're going to pass costs on to our contracts and try to get businesses to pay for those and still remain competitive so that we can actually have these group contracts. The other is currently we're required to have CARF certification in order to be paid for any type of supported employment services. And I was just curious if that was taken into consideration. And if it is not, will DDS be reviewing that and possibly making a change in that requirement for supported employment services, since none of the other DDS services require that?
Well, so I'll answer for my part. The answer is similar to what was asked earlier about whether or not we include licensure costs for day programs. So there are not specific factors built in the rate models for those expenses, but again, the provider survey, which is the basis for setting those administrative rates, did include accreditation and licensing expenses. And then again, speaking on behalf of DDS, I think everything that is submitted through the public comment process is going to be considered. Whether or not it changes is another question, but everything is going to be considered, which is why we're taking the time to present all this information to you today. So moving back to the PowerPoint. Moving next to work activity programs. From a rate model perspective, these rates are going to look very similar to what we saw for group supported employment. Would be billed on an hourly basis. There'd be geography-based rates. There'd be the non-English stipend. And then, based upon the feedback that we got, and we in fact followed up with some providers to make sure that the information was reported to us separately, some of these work activity programs are delivered at some high ratios, up to one staff person for every 35 participants. So we built rates that accommodate a variety of different staffing ratios. At a certain point, we were going to build 35 different staffing ratios for our work activity program. So we trip over the ranges. We have a rate for 1 to 4, 1 to 5, 1 to 6. And at a certain point, we start doing 1 to 10 to 1 to 15, 1 to 15 to 1 to 20, 1 to 20 to 1 to 25, et cetera. Again, it's probably not going to be altogether surprising, but if you're delivering services at the 1 to 35 ratio, the resultant rate is going to be dramatically less than the rate that exists today. But again, we're not here to suggest the elimination of any services, but we want to build rates that reflect the various services that are in existence. And we heard from folks that they were delivering services at that ratio, so we build rates to accommodate that. But again, you're spreading the cost of a single direct support professional over 35 people. So those rates, when you look at the rate model packet, are pretty low. On a per person basis, on a per direct care worker basis, they actually come out reasonably high in my estimation. But otherwise, from a rate model perspective, it looks the same as what you see for group supported employment.
Eric from Golden Gate. Was there a 90% attendance in the group supported employment? I'm sorry.
Yes.
In my experience, that rarely happens. Usually, places find a substitute person if the crew is a 3 or 4 person crew. Usually, in a contract, there's sort of a commitment to deliver that workforce. And so, I don't know if that 90% maybe a good idea to take a look at that.
I'm happy to, but that would just lower the rate, of course.
That's the confusing part. It would lower
But, well, so let me just make the
I'm struggling with that.
because I'm a simple person doing simple math. So if you have the cost of employing a direct support professional making $20 an hour, and you have a 5-person group, on a per person basis, that works out to $4 per hour, right? But let's say that we built in a 20% absence factor, so rather than 1 to 5, we're paying to 1 to 4. So now you're paying $5 per person, right? So because we have a fixed cost of that staff. So as the denominator goes down, because of the absence factor, the cost per person goes up.
Can I ask a question about the attendance? And you said it was based on provider survey data, correct? Is that, looks like 90% is consistent through all the models, is that correct?
It is, what's built in the models, yes.
And I can't recall the provider survey was it broken down by service type, the attendance rate? Do we have more granular data from this provider survey on the attendance rate?
Yes. And it was in a relatively narrow band, and that 90% is generally speaking, although again, there will, I think, be an exception or two, generally speaking, how to characterize this, it's a higher absence factor than was reported to us. So rather than 90% for many of the services, we were reported like 92 or 93%. And again, we did a standardized assumption, which, just like we talked about yesterday, when we're doing these sorts of standardizations, we're largely making sure that we're erring on the side of increasing the rates, and the same thing is true on the attendance factor. So if we use the more granular level of detail, more often than not, we'd be looking at increasing the attendance rate and decreasing the rate.
I'm just hearing from a lot of people, and I think around the room we've been hearing it, that 90% just doesn't feel right compared to what we know, but
when I presented the results to the group back in October, November, I said that's outside of our experience. I mean, ordinarily what we expect to see for these programs is in the mid-ish 80s, 84, 85, 86%.
I'm hearing 70 to 80. That's
so, I mean,
something that can, okay.
So I mean, that's I share that very same observation and said this is my experience working across the country, but that's not what we heard here specifically in California.
So, Aaron, UCP, I would echo that comment, but just to clarify, I did notice we didn't go over it, but on the medical model for the day programs, the attendance factor is adjusted. That's at 80%, right? If I'm looking at the right pages.
You are.
Okay, so I just want to make that note. At least I don't know if that was adjusted in other programs, but I did at least notice one time that it was.
Amy from the Association of Regional Center Agencies. I wonder if the difference in the absence rate or attendance rate that everyone is noting, as well as you, Stephen, is because right now providers are billing on a daily basis. And so if a person attends a portion of a day, they're considered to be there, whereas the attendance or absence rate may be higher if they're billing on an hourly basis, that person that leaves to go to the doctor's appointment, the person that arrives late because of something that happened at home, those kinds of factors.
Yeah, I think very reasonable point actually.
This will, so also, this would be, again, a policy change in group support employment going back to, we have currently billed per job coach, so this is going back to a participant billing, which we went away from a little bit, so it would be in our comments, due to wanting to ensure you had a job coach on site and to increase the number of smaller activities per person, and typically in sense larger blocks of people to be in the community. So again, that's the ACDS side of it. So in the work activity, you said the same as group support, so there's no facility costs, but a part of technically up to 50% of the day could be spent in rehab and training and other activities, which would require facilities which are not remunerated by the contract. So are those costs captured somehow in those rates?
So, so that's something that probably ought to, we probably ought to take a look at. There is no, as has been observed, no program space built into these rate models. So that takes us to transportation, which I can tell you from a HCBS rate setting perspective is the most frustrating service for which to set a rate. So where we landed was a rate on a trip basis and a one-way trip. So if we're talking about transportation to and from a day program, there would be 2 trips during that day, transportation to the program and transportation from the program or back home, and usually going 2 units of service or 2 trips. We have specifically not built in overhead costs of the transportation rate. Rather, what we've done is establish this transportation coordination rate, which is also subsuming the transportation brokerage rate. So let me kind of explain what the rationale behind this was. The idea was that transportation is being delivered in a variety of different fashions. We wanted to build a rate model that was flexible enough to accommodate that. So there are some circumstances where you have someone who's performing a brokerage function, and actually by the regulations today, they can't also be providing the transportation. So in that circumstance, they continue to bill this rate, which is also on a trip basis, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then the person who's delivering the transportation would bill the transportation piece of the rate. But then you have other circumstances where providers are performing both functions. They are handling their own logistics, and they're handling their own transportation service delivery as well. In that particular circumstance, once again, that provider is going to be billing 2 different rates for each trip. They're going to be billing the transportation rate, and they're going to be billing the coordination rate. The concept here, again, was just to say that we want a rate that's the transportation and a rate that's the administrative function, that we can accommodate the fact that we have brokerages in some cases, not in other cases, and then also circumstances where you have a day program providers delivering themselves or subcontracting with other folks. We wanted to do something that we thought was going to be reasonably flexible to accommodate the various ways that transportation is being delivered today. So again, just the kind of long and short of it is, transportation to and from a day program is going to end up having 4 discrete bills for that person, because you're going to have 2 trip rates, the trip rate to the program, the trip rate home, then you're going to have 2 coordination billings, one for the trip to the program and one for the trip home from the program. So that's why when you get to that rate model, which we'll turn to in just a moment, you're not going to see any of those operating or administrative expenses built in, because it's in the coordination rate. If you're doing it all, you're going to get paid for your administration and operations. It's going to be part of the separate bill. So this is kind of the opposite of what we did on the supported living, right, where we're proposing to eliminate 894 because we think it ought to be built into the underlying service rate. But because we potentially have different entities here, where it's not always going to be delivered by the same provider, if someone's doing the logistics function, the delivery function, we wanted to make sure that that was accommodated. The alternative was to put it all into the rates and say you're the day program provider but don't want to handle your own logistics, and then you would in turn subcontract with the broker and make your own arrangements in terms of what that payment amount would be. Decided that was not going to get us any measurable benefit, so landed on this as our approach. In terms of the rate variance, we have geography-based adjustments, and then we also have a rate based upon ambulation. So we have a standard rate, and then we have what I think we're referring to as an enhanced rate for folks who are not ambulatory. So account for the greater amount of time it takes to do pickups and drop-offs, as well as the costs associated with having modified vehicles to accommodate a wheelchair, for example. So with that introduction, we'll go to the rate model, which is on page 1170. So what we have built into this model is the same DSP type wage assumption, so the $14.89 per hour, same benefits package, and you'll see productivity. Now, one thing that is not always intuitive is we still make a discount for travel time without individuals. In the trucking industry, you refer to as the deadhead miles, right? So you have to go from the proverbial yard to your first pickup point, and then after your drop-off point, you have to go back to the yard, so to speak. And so even though this is a, by definition, transportation rate, we still have to make a productivity adjustment for services that are being delivered without someone being in the vehicle. And then we wanted to make, or needed to make, assumptions about what the average length of a trip is going to be. And so you'll see that we landed on 25 miles on average. And then we also wanted to account for, again, not just the time associated with those deadheading miles, but also the mileage associated with it. So that's set at 50% or 12.5 miles of the 25-mile total trip. From there, we build in supervision, program operations, and administrative expenses. And then we're assuming that the average trip ultimately includes 5 people being transported. results in that trip rate of about $10, just shy of $10 per trip. So again, to use the model, and I said it includes program operations and administration, and obviously it does not do that, as I pointed out earlier. So the $992 is exclusive of those costs, which we'll see in a moment. So just the cost of transportation comes out to about $10 per trip per person.
So per trip is one way, right? Okay. I have another question. We have a 12 mid-size bus, which require a Class B driver license. And very expensive to hire the driver. So would that be considered, what kind of driver license required?
So the answer to that right now is no. We had conversation about whether or not we wanted to build rates that vary based upon the number of people transported, because they're potentially going to be offsetting costs. When you're transporting more people, obviously you're spreading certain costs over a greater number of individuals. So I don't know that it will work out to be measurably different. You'd have a higher acquisition cost, potentially higher insurance or cost of employing people, but you're also going to be transporting a lot more individuals, so there's the potential that would end up offsetting itself. But right now, we have a bottom line assumption of a standard vehicle at the 58 cent per mile IRS rate, and a typical number of individuals on the trip of 5 people.
So I'm not sure who else runs transportation here, but there's two distinct models, which is generally the very small Class C vehicles, one-way trips, 1 or 2 people in a vehicle, often a direct trip, so very short amount of time on the vehicle, to programs, what we call fixed route, which is kind of what you're talking about, but will often serve more than, say, 5 people. And the one-way trip is not, you can't, that's a kind of a misnomer, because you're not picking up 5 people and going to one site. You're picking up a variety of people going to a variety of sites. So it's hard to say consumer served 5 per one. So the fixed route typically is those Class B vehicles, Class B drivers, larger vehicles, larger costs, different sort of pickup times and wait times versus the direct one way. So by combining this into one model, but then also separating out those components, you're blowing my mind a little bit as far as trying to figure out what this does. So we might need some more time. I don't even know how to evaluate that, because it's so different from how transportation is typically coordinated and the different types of services, and then the funding is often, well, as you guys probably found out, through route mile, through hours. It's difficult to know. I can tell you the wages for Class B, though, that's something you need to factor in. We'll need to factor in at some point. Those are very significantly higher costs. Somebody operates with Class C and B drivers. You can't lose that, and I see that's not changed on the my end either. So just a couple general comments. I'm not sure what to do with how you're combining everything there. It makes it hard to figure out.
Hi, Wendy Forkas over here. I just had a question. I know that there's also supplemental transportation services for like day programs, and I was wondering, is this the only transportation funding model? Because in those situations, I know that having 5 people in a vehicle would be challenging. So I just wanted to, and also the rate I think would be challenging, I guess. So I just wanted clarification on that.
So I'll tell you what's in, and you can tell me whether or not I've answered your question. So this is the rate for the transportation function. There is a rate for a transportation assistant that we have a different rate model for. So when you said supplemental transportation, I'm not sure if that's what you were getting at or not.
No, for day programs, because transportation has been so challenging, they often will have be vendorized. As long as they have a day program, they can do what they call supplemental transportation services, where they can pick up those individuals in their day program and drive them to the first meeting point for the day program. So it's not vendorized as a standalone transportation program, but it allows the service provider to be paid separately to transport those individuals to their program and back home from their program at the end of the day. Because as you've noted, it's not included in the day program rate, the transportation to the program and the transportation home.
Yeah, so this is the envisioned means for paying for those expenses, the to and from the home and day program.
Okay, and so it's based on 5, because most standard vehicles have 5 seats available? I mean, that would include the driver in a standard vehicle, 5 people.
Yeah, I mean, the expectation with 5 people, the driver is more that it's going to be like a 7-passenger type of vehicle. Which I think, I don't recall precisely from the provider survey, but I think that's what was reported to us as being the typical vehicle size.
Probably for transportation service providers, but for supplemental, that would probably not be the case because it's the actual staff vehicle that they're utilizing. So it's usually just a normal 4-door vehicle.
Jamie, you turn to your point.
So we'll stay, go ahead.
I was waiting, okay. This is Jamie Davis from Rin Ventures. I don't see where attendance is factored in. If we're assuming a 90% attendance, then there's only going to be 90% of people riding the vehicles.
So right now, the assumption is that a trip is going to consist of 5 people. There is, as you point out, no adjustment to that figure.
So routes are usually for both by the transportation company and also for supplemental. We set routes and people aren't reshuffled every day based on attendance. So if there's 8 people that come on a vehicle with a vendored company and 2 are absent, there's 2 trips that aren't paid for. Yet the same cost for transporting all of them.
Yeah, so that's part of the underlying philosophy of the setting rates in this manner. Is this is supposed to be the approximate cost? So like in your example, you're scheduled to transport 8 and you transport 6. Based upon our assumptions, you're making out really well, right? Because we've assumed that you're only transporting 5 people, so you're able to bill for 20% more than we expected the cost to actually be.
So all of our vendor transportation that isn't what we do, but the other companies that bring people, none of them are bringing just 5. They're Class B licenses, they're bringing 10 or more, and they're already hard enough to keep in business in our county. I mean, transportation companies are falling left and right. A couple of years ago, we had 300 clients who were suddenly left without transportation because 2 companies folded. And, you know, this doesn't seem to correlate well with what they're getting now. Just a comment.
Michelle, a question from the community. They're recommending that you group 880 and 875. And then there's a question as to, is the rate per client for 5 clients, so that's the rate for each client, or is that the group rate for that one trip?
That is the rate on a per person basis for that trip. So if you look up above, the cost per trip is about $50. We divide by the assumed 5 people on the trip, and that's how we get to the $10 per person per trip. So we'll move on to the next rate model, which is going to be page 11.
I thought you were going to do coordination.
That is what I'm going to do.
Oh, okay. Then go.
Unless you'd like me to do something different, Eric.
No, I thought you were going to go to professional behavioral. And
We're going to take a break before we get there.
Okay.
We're going to do transportation.
Okay, perfect. What a good idea, Steve.
I learned from the best, my friend. 1191 is the page in your PDF. So this rate model has, I think, the fewest number of lines in any of our rate models. So you'll see some of the assumptions repeated from the previous page. 5 people per trip, the cost per trip of about $50. We're doing $10 per day for program operations. Again, we talked yesterday that we have these decision rules in terms of how we accommodated that. So that comes out to $20 per day, which is equivalent to what we're doing on the day program side. And then the administrative percentage gives us at $10 plus $18 of coordination costs per trip. We divide by 5, the number of people assumed to be on that trip, and we're left with a rate of $3.63. So in order for those folks to evaluate the transportation rate, you really need to take a look, unless you're relying upon a broker, but if you do both the logistics and the delivery, you need to look at these numbers in tandem, right? So you have the $10 rate for the transportation itself, the $3.63 for doing the coordination, what we're now calling the coordination function. So the total rate per trip per person is $13.60 roughly per trip. And so most folks are on 2 trips per day.
Now I have a question. This is Eric again from Golden Gate. I'm scouring my knowledge of our transportation broker in my head, but I know part of the function of the brokers for us that's really valuable is sort of this third-party oversight of all the different transportation entities. So quality assurance, driver training, I think they check on insurance, you know, contractual agreements around insurance, those kind of things. And it seems like you're bundling it back to the entity that's doing it. It's hard to imagine that they can do all those things, you know, on themselves.
So that's the reason that we include not just the administrative cost, but also the operations cost in the coordination function. So you can tell me that you don't think there's enough money built in the rate model, and I understand that position, but that was the premise here. That includes, well, that sort of not just the admin, but also the what we refer to as program operations functions as well, which I think is the type of thing that you described.
Okay.
So again, we can talk about whether or not the rate's sufficient to perform that function, but that's why we included not just admin, but also the operations piece on this side of the rate.
But do you, I mean, some of those functions, it seems unlikely to be as effective if someone's doing it. I'm running a transportation company and I'm doing those functions upon my own company. So it becomes internal QA, internal driver training. So, see what I'm saying?
I understand the point that you're making, and obviously that can be really extrapolated all the services, but I don't think it's true that the majority of transportation is delivered through a broker today. I could be mistaken about that. So I mean, that already I think describes the situation that currently exists. So I'm not trying to argue your points, but I know that that's markedly different from the situation that we currently find ourselves in.
Okay, I'll check the numbers. I have no feel for the numbers on this one. So
Eric again with UCP. So I'm thinking a little bit more about this. We're making a lot of assumptions about cost of vehicle, cost of the driver, and number of people on the vehicle that vary really widely. On the back of my math, and I know you're giving feedback, you know, for the model as well as the overall rate, but by my quick calculations, this is a little bit more, it gets you about halfway, maybe a little bit more than halfway there, but for what our per trip cost would be as a transportation provider. So I'm pretty concerned about this one. I just don't see those numbers, that the $3.63 plus the $9 and change, or the other number if we're non-ambulatory for those two. I mean, that might get you 60% of the way there, but I'm seeing some significant challenges with this model.
Not seeing other discussion on transportation. Our next and final section is services. Well, actually, I have one more. I guess we'll go back to the PowerPoint presentation, and we'll wrap up with 2 very quick statements. So we talked about transportation. We talked about transportation coordination. I mentioned earlier, because I misunderstood the question, there's going to continue to be the transportation assistant rate. So that's someone, in addition to the driver, at that level of support is needed. And so that rate includes geography-based adjustments as well as the non-English stipend as appropriate and applicable. And then, again, not to give short shrift to anything, but we've talked about supplemental program support by regulating the residential and the non-residential context. So the rate models themselves are the same. So we continue to have a supplemental day program support service that we build on an hourly basis. Will be subject to regional center variation and the non-English stipend. Okay, so 2:30 now. Let's take a 15-minute break, and we will wrap up with behavioral and professional services, and then just talk about the public comment process.
The new one.
So I was talking about that with the wage. I mean, are you guys paying your taxes?
That's being
started, so if you can return to your seats. So in the PowerPoint presentation, we're starting back on slide 108. And so this is where we've grouped what we refer to as behavioral and professional services. So leading off in terms of the service codes with those behavioral services, we have 6, 12, 13, 15, 16, and 20. And those are the codes that correspond to various behavioral professionals. Those are all people with different qualifications, so therefore we would expect that we're going to continue to maintain different rates for each of them, so there's no consolidation there. From here, though, we start talking about parceling out some of these other existing service codes and kind of sending them home from our perspective. So it would be the draft rate models reflect the elimination of service code 048, and with those services to be redirected to the other service code that corresponds to the qualifications of the staff delivering current services. So for example, when we looked at the provider survey results for 048, a fair amount of those services were being delivered by people who would fall under either 612, 613, etc. So rather than have them bill under this code or this code, we would push them back into the primary behavioral support codes, that 600 series codes. Same thing is true for 605, that the code would be eliminated and staff would be billing based upon their qualifications. We have infant developments, which will have some changes we'll get to in a moment. Crisis evaluation, behavioral intervention, again, that service code would continue to persist. Then we go to 103, the specialized health treatment and training, another code that we propose to eliminate. And then the folks would bill under the service code that corresponds to their professional qualifications. So this has a fairly expansive definition, everything from docs to nurses to dentists. So they would be billing under the service codes that correspond to them. We'll come back to what our intent is with those in a moment. For specialized recreational therapy, we would recommend that that go to usual and customary rates. So if you look at least what's in the fairly thin service definition, includes things like equine therapy, recreation therapy, one or two other things that would seem to have a fairly robust private market that could be the basis for a usual and customary rate. And then for 115, 116, and 117, again, the proposal would be to eliminate those service codes and that the staff or therapists would be billing under the other service code that corresponds to their qualifications. So it's fairly apparent that we're proposing the elimination of a fair number of these service codes and folding people back under the code that corresponds to their qualifications. So if you're a nurse delivering services under 115, 116, or 117, there's already a nursing code in existence. It's not part of our scope of work, so I don't remember off the top of my head. I think it's in the 700s somewhere. But you would bill under that code because you're a registered nurse. If you're a doc, you bill under the codes that correspond to that. If you're an OT, PT, or speech, you bill under the service codes that correspond to those respective professionals. And so this is where I just want to reemphasize for providers and probably as much as anybody else for regional centers, where we're really relying on people to take a look at these proposals and see if there's something that's being delivered under these service codes that we might be missing. Again, we're hamstrung a little bit because there are not regulations around these, so we know that they're being done for a lot of different things, but we might not know everything that they're being used for. So if there's something that does not fit back into another service code, we want to hear about that and think about what it is we might need to do in order to accommodate those existing supports. So the next slide, 110, kind of illustrates this point for clinical staff. So one of the things that we talked about is the standardization and simplification of the service code system. So to summarize what we're intending to do here is services will be billed under the service code and rate that corresponds to the rendering provider's qualifications. So my example is physical therapists. We know, based upon the provider survey results, that physical therapists are billing in all kinds of different places. They might be billing under that 103 service. They might be billing under 115, 116, and 117. They could be billing under adaptive skills under 605. Lots of different places where physical therapists might be billing for a service. Our draft rate models assume that they are going to be moved to the code that corresponds to physical therapy, which is service code 772. Now, at the same time, we also recognize that part of the reason that folks have been tossed near and far is because these codes might not have rates that are adequate to meet the needs of individuals, and people have used these miscellaneous service codes as workarounds, just like they've done for day programs and other services. And so where we've landed on there is because those codes are subject to the schedule of maximum allowances, that is to say the Medi-Cal rates, what we would propose to do is adopt the structure that's in place for the California Children's Services Program, where you take the Medi-Cal rates and you have an enhancement of just shy of 40%. So that would not necessarily be an across-the-board assumption that we're not assuming that everybody that in the regional center system needs that enhanced rate, but based upon the determination of the regional center, they could pay the enhanced Medi-Cal rates of the fee schedule plus the 39.7%. Judging by the audience, I'm kind of suspecting that we don't have a lot of therapists and nurses in the room to react to this particular recommendation, which is why I said I think really interested in the regional center's feedback in terms of how it is they're using each of these service codes to make sure that we've not missed something. Not hearing a lot of commentary on that particular and rather significant component of the draft rate models that are going to be delivered on Friday. We'll move on to behavioral services. Yes, please.
Amy Wessling, Association of Regional Center Agencies. I think just on first blush, the idea of being able to pay of regional centers being able to pay above the schedule of maximum allowances is really positive. You mentioned that it wouldn't necessarily be across the board, and I'm wondering if you have ideas or concepts about what would be required to allow for those additional or supplemental payment rates.
I think that's an area that really needs a lot more conversation. So we've identified that we shouldn't make the assumption that everything ought to get the enhanced rate, but there's not been a whole lot of additional conversation about what the specific criteria would be. So, I mean, as has been apparent, this is going to require a lot of regulatory framework along the lines of a lot of what's being recommended or put forward. So that would be one area where ultimately I think we're going to need to have some feedback from providers and regional centers as the infrastructure around these draft rate models is constructed. So I didn't give you a good answer because we recognize that there's a need to do that, but we don't have any specific directions that we're going in terms of determining who would not qualify for the enhanced rate. But I'll tell you that from my experience working for the state ED agency in Arizona, this is something that we encounter on a regular basis. For example, finding dentists who are willing to serve people with developmental disabilities, because there's oftentimes more time required to perform even a routine procedure. You might need to explain things more, you might need to take breaks, etc. So we had a very difficult time getting dentists who were willing to take our consumers. So we had to come up with something similar to this to pay enhanced rates for folks who need that additional level of care. And so the concept here is we wanted to build upon something that already exists in California, so we have the California Children's Services Program, and that maybe even seems pretty healthy in terms of incentivizing your allopathic type of providers to deliver services.
Yes, there from Golden Gate, I think your instinct around getting more information on the specialized therapeutic services is really important, and maybe we can, Amy and I reach out to the consumer community services directors who are meeting this week to really talk about the use of those, because my impression is we use those in a pretty important way. So we'll get you more information.
Thank you.
Hey, Jackie Clark, Placer County Office of Education Infant Program. On the OTPT and speech, is that just for the 116 and other codes that are going to be wrapped into the 700 codes? Is that just for the individual therapists providing services? It's not part of the infant programs, 8 to 5 infant programs?
So we're almost to that slide, but not quite. But I will give you the punchline so you can think about your response, which is that would also apply to the infant development programs, where the thought there is that's more limited to the special instruction type of services, and the other types of early intervention services like therapy would be, again, sent to their corresponding qualifications like that 772.
Then one question that would apply to infant programs, but also just for therapists that are just single service providers, is being compared to CCS therapists. Most CPS, if not all CCS therapists, work in a clinic. So the parents go to them, and there's not that lengthy drive out to their consumers.
Yeah, so I'll talk about it now because it's relevant not just to infant development, but to the broader concept of how we're addressing those clinicians. And so we did something similar in the rate work that we did in Hawaii, where we needed to set rates for BCBAs. And what we took a look at was the fee schedule that TRICARE, or the Veterans Administration, has. But we also recognize that that is primarily going to be a clinic-based setting. So we had to make adjustments to the published TRICARE rates to account for the fact that you're going to have fewer billable hours in a day because you're delivering community-based services. So
plus mileage expense.
Plus mileage expense, sure. So that premium in Hawaii worked out to a 25% premium. So we thought about doing that here in California, and we would have come up with, because we're not talking about the bottom line rate, we're talking about the ratios, how much should that rate be increased. And we would have included a similar sort of thing. I mean, that's our expectation, that you're going to be delivering 25% fewer services in the community than in the clinic. So then we took a look at what's available in the California Children's Services Program. That's greater than 25%, it's 40%, so rather than use our methodology, we use that methodology, because otherwise we're going to publish it. So on slide 111, we're talking about behavioral services, and from a rate modeling perspective, we just lumped them together because they're all very similar, again, from a rate model. So this is the behavior analyst, the behavior management consultant, the assistant behavior, the associate behavior analyst, the management assistant, and the paraprofessional. Services would be billed on an hourly basis. There would be geography-based adjustments, group services of up to 1 to 3, and then the non-English stipend would only apply to the technician and paraprofessional qualifications. It would not apply in terms of the way the rate models are currently constructed to the more professionalized folks, the BCBAs or the BCADAs and the like. So we will jump quickly to the rate model, which is on page 1437. And so, again, I won't spend a lot of time on this because when we're talking about one-to-one services in the community, the numbers are going to be a lot different, but the structure of the rate models are pretty similar. So we have the wage assumption. Again, we've built this on an RBT type of position. This is the paraprofessional. We go through the wages, benefits, productivity, mileage. If you scroll down a little bit, we have supervision. The supervision, of course, here is funded at a very high amount because RBTs are required to be supervised by a BCBA. As was asked earlier, the BCBA is equivalent to like a psychologist wage, at least according to the current BLS classification scheme. So a very high cost for supervisors for the paraprofessionals because they have to be a BCBA in compliance with the national board. I don't have the rate models loaded here, but then when you take a look at the other services, particularly the behavior analysts who aren't subject to supervision, you're not going to see that component at all, right? They're not supervised by somebody else. So the supervision just applies to those folks who work under the supervision of a BCBA. So this also applies to the assistant positions as well. And from there, we have program operations as well as administrative expenses.
The the supervision, number of hours of supervision per week, was that pulled from provider surveys, from some sort of national standard? I apologize if you already mentioned that.
I did not mention it. I appreciate the question. That is the requirement, and I can never get their name right, because it's the BCAB, and they sort of certify BCBA, so it's the national board's requirements for what the supervision is for an RBT.
What page is this?
1,437.
So it seems like you're collapsing and it's all BCBA. Is there any kind of rate for MFTs, psychologists?
So,
or is that going to the 700 service code? I'm not familiar with them, so.
I'm trying to recall the regulations around these services as they exist today. I don't recall if they're quite that broad. So I think the better part of valor is to not guess and get back to the answer to that question. I'm sorry, I don't recall off the top of my head.
It appears that the assumption is that the supervision is all done by the BCBA. I think in a lot of cases, these services are being provided in sort of a 3-tier model, sort of akin to the CNA, LVN, RN model, but with the behavioral equivalent. So is there any allowance for a 3-tier model for behavioral services under this methodology?
We have a 3-tier model. So we have a rate for paraprofessionals, then we have a rate for the associate or assistant positions, and then we have a rate for the BCBA type of positions or the management consultants. So we have 3 different rates right now that represent that tiered approach. We're only presenting here on the overhead just one of them for the paraprofessionals.
But the supervision is only done by the BCBA in this
It is, which
assumption.
I believe is the requirements. I think the board requires that those 2 hours of supervision to be delivered by a BCBA.
Okay.
People are affirming.
Yes, you are correct.
Still doesn't work.
Jordan Lindsay, quick question. And this is really important because I hear often the BCBAs that say, we really wish we could provide services for regional center clients. We just can't because of the rate. And you chose CCS as the comparable rate. Is that?
No.
No.
So the CCS methodology only applies to services that are kind of outside of our scope of work. So that goes back to the physical therapists or the nurses and like that are billing under the 700 series code. So those services are typically subject to the scheduled maximum allowances, right? There's a rate that Medi-Cal has set for physical therapists under service code 772. And we know that in some cases, regional centers have authorized physical therapists under other service codes because the rate under 772 is inadequate. But we want to move them back to the code that corresponds to their qualification. In order to accommodate the concerns of regional centers about those rates not being sufficient, we said that you can authorize the enhanced rate akin to what's authorized under the California Children's Services Program. So that's how we're handling everything that we're proposing to eliminate or to move out of the existing service codes. As it relates to the behavioral services, Medi-Cal, as I understand, more or less follows DDS's lead. So the rate models you see here are the rates that are proposed or are going to be included in the report on the how we pay for each of the services.
I just hope that they are comparable to, what's interesting about BCBA is compared to many things else we do in our community is that we actually have a private rate that's comparable with insurance. So I hope that this is comparable to what, let's say, a Kaiser is paying or any other mandatory payer under essential benefits. Because we know exactly what the going rate is in the private market for this type of service.
Yeah, I encourage folks to take a look at the bottom line. As I recall, the rates are pretty substantially higher than what's currently being authorized. We took a look at, because BCBAs, of course, are a concern across the nation, there's some amount of research around that. A fair amount of it's been actually authorized by the VA, so like the Brand Corporation did some research in terms of what's typical across various public payer systems as well as some private insurance systems that they have access to. And as you know, that's not always the easiest data to find. Private insurers typically don't publish their fee schedule. But some of the work that Rand and other consultant firms have done was certainly used to make sure that the rates that we're producing here are within the ballpark, and we're confident that they are. We certainly encourage people to look at the bottom lines and let us know if you disagree.
So the 115, 116, and 117, essentially you're recommending to eliminate it, and then it would be billed directly from that professional and no longer could be served by a staff that's under a professional, besides the paraprofessional.
So I think for many of the folks, depends upon the qualifications. I believe, though don't quote me on this because again it's outside my scope of work, if you're using, to continue my physical therapist example, I believe that Medi-Cal has a PTA rate, a physical therapist rate, so that's physical therapy assistant rate, I should say. So that would be the rate that would apply to that particular professional.
So the service has to be directly delivered by the professional.
Well, I guess, how are we defining professional? Or is it a PTA as a professional?
Correct.
Yes.
Right, so in your example, the
Right.
PT would be the one that's directly providing the service,
Well,
not a
could be
PT assistant.
Either one of them could be delivering the service, but there would be different rates associated with those, just like there's different rates for an RN versus an LVN. But, I mean, I can't reemphasize enough, if there's something that's being done under those codes now that folks think was going to be lost, that's the type of thing that we want to hear about. I mean, and I will tell you, we did take a look at, say, provider survey results to see what sorts of job titles people listed, and it was politely a hodgepodge. So there were folks reporting that secretaries were delivering services and other things that just did not make a lot of sense in terms of direct support professionals. So we know there's some things going on, but again, because there's not a lot of insight from a billing perspective, from looking at claims and even provider survey was not particularly illuminating. That's why we're asking you to tell us if there's something that's being done with those codes that cannot be flung back to, say, the Medi-Cal fee schedule. And so that's going to take us to the infant development program. I'll click back to the PowerPoint just to walk through the specific components of the rate study, and then we'll go to the rate model itself. So as I mentioned a moment ago, the idea here is that the service code will be limited to special instruction, and if there's a better term for that, we're certainly open to changing it, but the early childhood teacher specialist sort of provider. And so other services, as I said, that are being delivered under this 805 code today would be moved back to the scheduled maximum allowances, again, largely under the 700 series service codes, like PT, for example. So there are very much PTs who are billing under 805. Under our recommendation, they would be billing under 772. That Medi-Cal fee schedule potentially would be enhanced to accommodate whether it's travel or difficulty of service.
Jackie Clark. I have a question under how you have you said special instruction, that's early childhood teachers or specialists. So are they early childhood special education teachers? Because there's a difference.
So we have 3 categories of staff qualification. If you look at the bottom part of slide 112, and so we have the folks with the licensed professional.
And what would that be, licensed professional?
So the master's level folks.
Master's level and credentialed? I'm just thinking,
I appreciate it.
Like for instance, the deaf and hard of hearing teachers, they're credentialed by the state teachers credentialing system. Some have masters, some don't, but they are credentialed staff and are directly corresponding to what the state calls as qualified. So in our early start law, you have to have qualified staff seeing children that have those cerebral incidents conditions, whether they're solely low incidence or regional center staff, or regional center vendor children too. So a child that has hearing loss or vision loss then would still have to have a credentialed deaf and hard of hearing teacher or a vision teacher.
Sure.
So whether or not they have their masters, I mean, they could, but they would still have their credential. That's why I was asking, what is licensed?
Well, no, I appreciate that. It's an excellent question. So I'll tell you kind of what our high-level thinking was, and I think exactly this sort of feedback is what we're going to be looking for. So for the licensed professional, as I alluded to, we made that analogous to a master's degree, but if that needs to be more expansive definition to include things like a credential, that's what we want to hear. Then we have the next level of specialist, which is like a bachelor's level staff. And then we, again, we can talk about if there ought to be set aside or how that ought to look. And then we have paraprofessionals, because we did want to accommodate the fact that we have people at a variety of different skill levels, supervision responsibilities, expertise, et cetera. So we have this three-tier system. You know, from our perspective, it's easy to define masters, bachelors, other, but that's fairly imprecise. It lacks nuance, and we're looking for expertise from you and others in terms of adding more nuanced definitions to those three classifications.
And that makes sense also to the ICC personnel standards outline that kind of look at qualified and different levels, because they're all very needed, but you do have different pay scales for those three. But the other thing that I was thinking of is if 805 infant programs are just for the credentialed teachers or the non-credentialed teachers and paraprofessionals that are doing special instruction, and then I assume the agency that hires, like the 805 infant program agency, would hire the OTs, PTs, and speech, but bill under a different service code. I'm wondering how that works, though, when we look at the mission and purpose of early intervention is to teach the parent build capacity in the parent, teach the parent intervention strategy, so they are the ones that are actually providing the intervention in their daily routines, and the staff are there coaching them. And you have to have your top level staff there, because the parents will be asking questions, well, what about this, in those situations? And that is the service where we're teaching the parent rather than directly working with the child in isolation. Lots of times the staff person that's out there, whether they're the speech therapist, the OT, PT, or the educator, will say, oh, that's a very good question. Let me see if my vision person can come out. Let me see if my speech therapist can come out. Let me see if our OT or PT. And under our current 805 model, you can do that because we have kind of consultation hours built in that you don't have to have a separate purchase then for that speech therapist to come out to talk to the parent about that very specific language development question that they asked that the educator didn't feel like they could answer, but they needed that speech person to do. So in this model, would we have to then submit a request to the regional center service coordinator to write a purchase just for that 1 hour to go out for a team visit, or how I'm just trying to figure out how the concept of team, how does that work when you don't have all your team members under one service code that authorizes you to do that? And then what is the time frame and of delay then that we get back to that parent with that team visit?
Again, raising excellent points, and this falls into the answer that I've given for a couple of other scenarios where we're talking about how best are we authorizing these services when we're doing things in a way that's different today, whether it's center and community services or long-term and short-term services. I think the circumstance that you just lay out is another example of that, and what ought to be done to make sure that we're not causing unnecessary delays and producing barriers to access to services. So I don't have an answer for you, but it is part of that overall milieu of things that we've been speaking about in terms of we need to figure out from a billing perspective what those rules would look like and what sort of instructions and systems changes potentially need to be made.
So are these the kinds of, is this the kind of input you would like? Are these the kinds of questions you're looking for?
I personally would love that sort of input,
okay.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that DDS impress upon us is, as a general rebuttable hypothesis, we're not looking to eliminate supports that exist today. We're just looking to make sure that we've created a system that makes sense, it's rational, and that the rates reflect the cost of living services. So, all the things that have been brought up, both yesterday and today, are really helpful to making sure that we've not missed something and not inadvertently cut something off that was not being sent. That's not to say that, I brought up earlier that Is every single rate proposed to increase? No, and that's not going to be the case. It's not our charge to increase every single rate. But we're also not looking to eliminate supports that are being delivered today as a result of us having missed something.
And just building in that concept of team availability is really important because birth to 3 age population changes so fast, and the parents are so excited about learning about child development that they want to be able to access that information kind of immediately.
Understood. Absolutely. And then just so dropping down to the bottom part here of slide 112, be reimbursed on an hourly basis. We have rate variance, again, based upon regional center, the staff qualification, which we talked about and we'll illustrate in a moment. The setting, although we've had a number of conversations with infant development programs in different parts of the state, and we understand that there are some center-based programs that exist, so we wanted to build rates again to reflect that. And others can make determinations about what is or is not the best way to deliver services. And then group services as well. Again, the expectation, much like many of these services, is one-to-one, but there are times I understand that it might be delivered on a limited basis. So we have rates to reflect all of those circumstances. So with that, we'll jump to the rate model. And as we do that, it's going to be even page number 1500, 1500. And so what we've chosen here is the middle of that 3-tiered system. So we talked about the licensed professional, the specialist, and the paraprofessional. This is the specialist rate. So you'll see we have a wage assumption of $32.50 an hour, which comes out to $63,000 per year, $65,000 per year, I should say. The benefits package is the same, the productivity. You'll see that we do have lower productivity for this service than many of the other services that we've looked at today. And the expectation being that these are going to be oftentimes shorter encounters than we see for, say, personal assistance as an example. There are certainly exceptions to both of those, but ordinarily we would expect these to be shorter duration services, which has a tendency to lower productivity. We build in mileage, and then we build in a supervisor wage here as well. So just like we talked about a moment ago with the behavioral services, we have supervision built in, both for the paraprofessionals as well as the specialists, that middle category, the bachelor's level staff. And we use, I think, a social work type of position or a teacher position to represent this wage assumption. It's in, again, Appendix B to see specifically what wage values or what standard occupational classifications we use. Outside of that, though, from a modeling perspective, it's pretty straightforward. So, again, certainly interested in feedback on the values that are built in, but in terms of walking you through it, I don't have much to add. Wages, benefits, productivity, mileage, supervision, program operations, administration, and voila, there's the rate on the bottom line.
This is Jackie. I guess my main question is, again, like we've heard from some of the other models, is the time it takes to travel out to the families. And it looks like, I think there was a difference on the licensed staff per the specialized staff. One was, let's see, 156 miles a week that I, for miles, I divided by 5 days a week, 4 visits a day, so that's 7.8 miles in between, which, again, for those geographical areas that travel much more than 8 miles in between. And then the other is the time. It would take 12 minutes then to drive those 8 miles, 7.8 minutes. And that would have to include saying goodbye to the parents and the children, walking out to the car, driving to your next appointment, and then going in and saying hello. So that's not a lot of time to get from one point to the other. Even if you were only going 8 miles, 12 minutes to say goodbye. And then the thing that, this is too much information, I know, but the thing that a lot of staff have to account to is they're away from a bathroom 8 hours a day because we don't use the family's home. So you often have to stop in between sessions too for just your health needs. So 12 minutes is not a lot of time in between visits.
Okay, thank you. And I should have opened with mentioning that this is the rate for community-based services. Then we have another rate model, which is on page 1563 for center or facility-based services. So the differences you're going to notice are really related to productivity. If you're doing a center or clinic-based service, you're going to be more productive because your people are coming to you rather than you going to them. And then we also built in the cost of the facility as well. So you have those work costs to see people in your office. Outside of that, the assumptions I think are largely consistent in terms of wages, benefits, program operations, and administrative expenses. And of course, there's no mileage built into the center-based rate. So, moving back to the PowerPoint, unless there's other comments on infant development. The last service we have on our list to talk about here today is crisis evaluation and behavior intervention, mobile crisis, which, as I recall, is billed under service code 017. So this actually kind of follows, in some regards, the build-up for the infant development program. The rate model assumes that this would be reimbursed on an hourly basis. There will be subject to the regional variation. And then staff qualification. So we still have that three-tiered framework for these responses of a licensed professional, a specialist, and a paraprofessional. And I would say, just like we're encouraging and welcoming feedback in terms of who ought to be qualified to meet each of those three thresholds on infant development, we're looking for similar sort of feedback on crisis. But the idea, once again, is the licensed professional is someone who operates independently under a license. So that would be in cases like an LCSW or an LMFT, a bachelor's level position who works under the license of somebody else, and a paraprofessional would be someone without a bachelor's degree is the framework that we've envisioned. But we're, again, encouraging feedback on that topic. So I'm not going to, well, I guess we'll, because it's the last one loaded up, we'll go to the rate model itself. And this is, I think, going to be, again, for the middle professional, the specialist position. So the reason I wasn't going to cover it is because it looks a lot like infant development. So again, just want to tell people what's in it, but by the end of today, you should all be well versed in rate setting, particularly for these in-home services. So we have an assumption related to wages and benefits. Again, you can go back to Appendix B to look at what specific occupation classifications we use to target this wage, productivity, the mileage associated with the service, supervision for the specialist and the paraprofessional, and then program operations and administrative expenses.
What page number are you on? That's not my
Did I not
question.
read that one? Then I knew I should have followed my instincts and not pulled this rate model up. 1360.
Are you basing the training time on that, again, 35 hours?
We actually have a little bit less training built in for these folks. The expectation is that at that level, we're not getting as much ongoing training. So this, I think, is 25 hours.
Even for the paraprofessionals at the same, I didn't look, so still that lower training model?
I apologize for not having that committed to memory. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head.
I think that would be a concern in regards to expecting crisis intervention
For the paraprofessionals in
for
particular?
them to have more training rather than less training than 35 hours.
I'm sorry, I think I heard that backwards. So would you?
The paraprofessional.
Ought to have more training.
More training, correct.
Than the 25 hours or than the 35 hours?
Then the 35 hours.
Okay, thank you.
So this is a service that oftentimes now is billed, excuse me, as a contract service, whereby the regional center is purchasing a specified number of hours of support for its overall population, and there's lots of expectations around on-call time and those sorts of things. And I haven't seen any reference to contract-type services throughout the day or in this model specifically, so could you speak to if that's a shift in the way these services will be procured under your methodology, or whether there's something that I'm overlooking.
Nope, you're not overlooking, and it would be a shift. So the draft rate models we put forward would have the service reimbursed on an hourly basis based upon contact time rather than those contract amounts. I mean, as an aside, we had some conversations with providers, with I think a couple of regional centers, and then took a look at claims. And it seems like it's being used, as is the case for many service codes, in a variety of different ways across the regional centers. So some regional centers seem to have a single entity who provides supports within their catchment area, and others have up to, I think, a minimum of 4. Maybe someone even has 6 different folks doing services under 017. Because we talked about rather, potentially turning this into a per head amount, that you're providing that fixed level of coverage based upon the population of the regional center area, but we don't have a one-to-one relationship. So as it currently stands, as you observed, this would be reimbursed on an hourly basis.
One more question. Again, on a crisis intervention, there was no intention to overtime
Correct, there is no overtime assumption.
in a crisis.
Correct.
Oh, okay, fuck the manager.
That's all right, you're on your own.
So that actually gets me through all 2,100 pages of the rate model packet. Congratulations. We wanted to just to wrap up a little bit talking about where we go from here. So I think most, if not all of you, have already gone to our website to access these materials, but everything that we've been presenting here today, and so very much more, is available on our website. And so this is really the packet of information that's going to be included as part of the report. So as the director has mentioned a couple of times, we're going to have a narrative report, and it's really going to follow in a large degree what you saw in the PowerPoint presentation. I don't think there's going to be anything that's going to be particularly surprising to the folks who've sat through this last day and a half worth of meeting. Obviously, we're able to go into a little bit more detail in writing form and less detail on going through individual rate models. But largely what you see in the presentation, I think, encapsulates what it is we're trying to articulate. A little bit more conversation about different rate methodologies to kind of fill out some of the requirements of ABX 2.1 as opposed to the focus on what the draft rate models are for these meetings. But specifically what's included on the website today and is included as part of the overall submission on Friday is the draft rate models, this 2,100 page plus document we've been talking about. A report explaining our approach to establishing regional center cost variations. Again, that's kind of methodologically dense, but if folks really want to understand what the data sources were, what the calculations were, and how we group regional centers together, I would encourage you to take a look at that. The provider survey materials, which everyone in this room had access to previously. So that's the survey instrument, the survey instructions, the analysis packet, which is another 1,000-page plus document, as I recall. And then and so by the way, we're not going to be printing all of the reports. We'll be printing the narrative. Everything else will be put on the flash drive. As well as the PowerPoint presentation that we delivered to the rates work group back in October or November. We'll also be including information from the individual and family survey. So that's both the survey instrument itself as well as a PowerPoint presentation that had been previously shared with, although not publicly published, with the individual and family advisory committee that was put together specifically for the purposes of that survey. And then I will have the pleasure of giving this same presentation to an empty room in front of my computer and recording it, so anyone else who wants to sit through this presentation can listen to it at their convenience. So that will be available sometime next week when I gather the internal strength to do that. Of course, as has been mentioned a couple of times, in addition to these materials, on Friday the report itself will be released, as well as the fiscal impact analysis. What we estimate the cost of this would be on an annualized basis at full implementation, which, as folks can gather from what we've talked about today, this is not a flip the switch overnight sort of process that we're talking about. So, to state the obvious in a simple declarative statement, we are seeking public comments on the draft rate models, and in particular, not just the assumptions built into the rate models, but also some of the associated policy changes that we've built into our assumptions when building those rates. I'll just reference back to the kind of three categories of things I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation. Again, folks are welcome to comment on anything up to and including whether or not you like my tie, but really feedback on the specific factors and elements in the rate model. So do we include do we include the right factors? Is something missing? So I've heard overtime come up a time or two over the session today, so you'll note that's not in a lot of rate models. You might feel that factor is missing. Or you might feel like the assumption that we've built in is inadequate. I've heard a time or two that folks aren't happy with the wage assumption, particularly as it relates to Los Angeles County. So what's in the rate models and what those values are is the sort of feedback that we're looking for. The second category is the related changes to service requirements. Again, we had certain things in mind, rightly or wrongly, when we built these rate models. Those things that we thought were relevant and colored our decision-making process, we've tried our best to cover in the presentation today. So if you don't think moving the services out of 115, 16, and 17 is going to be workable, that's the sort of thing that we want to hear about. And that kind of flows into the third thing that I'd ask that you pay special attention to. And is there anything that's being done today that our proposals or set of draft rate models is not going to accommodate? Again, we're not here to guarantee that any specific changes or adjustments are going to be made, but those are the sorts of areas that I think feedback is going to be particularly valuable for us. So in terms of how we are looking to manage this, and certainly my colleagues from DDS can chime in as well, we're asking the rates work group to really play a lead role in concert with the regional centers and the regional center advisory committees to help gather, organize, and submit those public comments ultimately along to us. And so that's why folks are on this committee, is to serve not just as representative of your organization or your agency, but to serve the broader community. So we encourage you to work with your colleagues out there, share our proposals with them. Again, that's why we'll record the webinar, so if folks want to listen to it, the version of me presenting it, they're going to have the time to do so. And then ask them to work, then we ask that you work with your colleagues to put together comments and submit them kind of on behalf of your broader organizations or your broader constituencies. Does that make some sense? I mean, I guess I'm beating around the bush a little bit to say that we're not opening up the public comment process to all 20-some thousand providers in the state, because given the time frame that we are working, but we don't have the ability to process it. So we're really looking for you to play a lead role in representing your various groups and organizations. So, public comments are going to be accepted through March the 22nd, 2019. That's 3 weeks from this Friday. We put the email address up there on the screen. Some folks said, can you email me directly? You certainly can, but the likelihood of getting lost is much higher by having a dedicated email address. It will stay where you send it. So that's ddsvendorrates@burnshealthpolicy.com. Again, I ask you to be as thorough as you practically can be in submitting your comments. Again, if you want to say you hate the rates and you don't think it's high enough, that's okay, but that's not particularly actionable. And again, I don't speak for DDS, but I don't think you're going to get a lot of traction with those sorts of comments. What's going to be much more valuable to us is, for this reason, this reason, and this reason, we think you ought to consider an adjustment to what it is you put forward. And if there's any documentation that you think we ought to consider as part of your comments, we certainly encourage you to include that as well. So that could be information about historical attendance rates in your day program, since that came up this afternoon. Someone talked about regulations. I think we've covered most regulations, but if you do think there's something that we missed, feel free to send that along. Really, anything that helps to defend your position, I think, is only going to be valuable in your best interests.
Hi, Stephen. Heather here. I believe the department spoke with the executive directors that we each have a point person at our agency, and that you were looking at doing somewhat of a feedback, what would you call it, format, so that the structured feedback you received was easy to coalesce and organize. Is that on your website now?
It's not on our website now. I believe we'll be getting it up. And really, so a couple of things. Our point here is not to make it mandatory to use, but we think it's going to be helpful both for you to collect information as well as for us to analyze information given the time that we have. So it really is broken down at the moment into a couple different categories. The overall rate study process, which you thought we ought to be aware of if you have any specific concerns about our underlying methodology or our process. Then it's talking about cross-service issues. So an example of that would be the Los Angeles County wage question. That's not specific to a given service, that's specific to kind of universal services, so that would fall in that category. And then there's service-specific issues. If you don't agree with something we proposed for 805, that would go into that category. Then we further divide those latter two between the 5 primary factors in our rate model: wages, benefits, productivity, program operations, administration, and anything else that you care to comment on. Again, it's going to be really useful for us, for you to use that, because it allows us to quickly say, okay, here's all the comments we got on this specific topic, to read them, synthesize them, and ultimately make a determination about whether or not a revision ought to be made. But again, I hesitate to make it mandatory because I don't want folks to feel like we're limiting their ability to offer whatever commentary they would like to offer.
Okay, Marty C. Can. So on the comments, and again, appreciate the public comment period, which technically opens today through the 22nd, or officially the 1st through.
Our email address is live. So.
It is live, so for those of you who want to jump the gun. So couple of questions. One is, will Burns and Associates, and maybe just as important, this DDS, the administration, respond to the questions or the comments being made? So that we know that if we ask about the issues of overtime or the other issues that we have raised, and then whether or not it appears in the rate models, or you tweak the the rate study, or you don't. Burns, will there be a response? Because as people are submitting public comments and there's no response, there's no change in the rate study, I guess people can assume, it did not meet the standard of approval or whatever. But I think it's going to be important that the administration and Burns or whoever responds in some way. And also, will the questions or the comments that are collected be also submitted to the legislature when you finalize the report? I don't know what you're calling it, finalized or any revision of the report that will be given or due to the legislature or due to DDS on May 1st, that's the target date. And will that, so at least the other quick, will that report then go to the legislature?
Marty.
Is it working? There we go. Nancy Bargman. There's a lot of questions in that, so let me do my best and just remind me what I missed. So as far as like the comments and responding to them, what my initial thought is that it's going to be more as far as like themes and responses. Without seeing what the comments are at this point, I think it's hard to say that every single question or comment or everything's going to be responded to, but I would anticipate that we're going to be similar to what we've done in the past with responses, that we would be doing more of themes. But so once we start seeing some of those comments, I think I can better share with you how the response is actually going to be. I see you working on your mic.
I think they did this on purpose. It's a test. It gives you pause. Do you really want to say that? Oh, that got it. So one suggestion is I think a lot of us would really encourage the state, the administration, to also give some reasons why some public comment in terms of, like for instance, the issue of overtime, if that's not going to be included in any revision of the rate models, that the state, the department gives some reason why, and more than just saying, well, that historically has not been the case in previous administrations. That's not really a reason. That's just stating history, of which history is flawed, right? So if we're trying to correct history, we should talk about, well, why aren't we going to do that? And there's other issues like that too, the issues of compression, local minimum wage. A lot of these are issues that in the past the state has not taken up for various reasons, but also things have changed. There hasn't been this history of local minimum wage in the way that has been imposed in recent years, nor has there been, this constant increases in state minimum wage. All those are pretty new things in healthcare costs. So we really urge that it be helpful to everyone if you know, maybe not every comment, but where an issue is raised that we believe is important, you know, that some reason is given if it's not going to be included.
Sure. Thanks, Wayne.
I hope I didn't start. And thank you.
Carly Melvin. I really appreciate the amount of work that's gone into this and the thinking and the level of detail. And I think I've got my head wrapped around the majority of it, but the transportation is kind of what's scaring me. I don't feel like I've got a real grasp of all of the reasoning that we put in on the transportation. So the fixed route is one place. When we have staff driving, that's a whole different set of issues. And when I look at what you're proposing on the salary, if that's either our fixed route and professional drivers and the rules related to transportation in California, again, one whole set of different kind of management structure. And the staff, but neither of them seem right on the salary alignment that line up. So I think that if we're putting in a lot of work on process, I'd really appreciate knowing more what you're thinking about the transportation and also, you know, more of our work on the recommendations that we put forward to you on transportation. Thank you.
So I'll, given we have some time, I'll endeavor to spend a moment or two talking about this and some regard to me repeating what I've already said. So I think you have a pretty decent handle on the proposal, it sounds like, just based upon the feedback that you've given to me. Whether or not you agree with all the elements of the proposal is, I think, a different question entirely. But the couple of things that we took a look at first was recognizing that transportation is delivered in a couple of different ways in terms of the scheduling versus the delivery. And so that's why we landed on having a rate for those two different functions. And the scheduling is actually broader than that, of course, the overall administration and operations. But the actual delivery of the transportation and then the logistics and the administration and oversight sorts of components. And so we wanted to build a system that reflects the ability to do that. And it just means that if you do one of those functions, then you're doing two rates for each trip, the delivery rate and the operating or logistics rate, or coordination rate as we call it. In terms of the specific numbers, we spent a lot of time talking about the various ways that transportation is being delivered and how complex we wanted that reimbursement scheme to take a look. So I can tell you that if I were in a perfect world with unlimited data, the way I would build a rate is every time someone gets onto or off of a vehicle, I would record the odometer and then bill for the amount of time that they're on the vehicle based upon the number of people who are on that vehicle. We're not proposing that that's not feasible in any reasonable world at this point in time. So we wanted to do something we thought was reasonably straightforward. We thought the trip-based rate was the most straightforward way to provide reimbursement rather than doing it based upon mileage. Because when you do based upon mileage, is it based upon what you get on the vehicle or the total length of the trip is the tough metric to have. We didn't think hour was appropriate because some trips are going to fall into a too low a threshold to make that feasible. So we think trip is the right act to take. And then we're left with how many different rates or how many different variables we want to incorporate in this. So as you can see, it really hinges on two key assumptions when we're talking about transportation. What's the length of the trip? We have 25 miles is our assumption. And how many people are transported? We have 5 individuals. We gave some thought to effectively putting together a matrix where we have various trip lengths and various passenger group sizes. And that would end up with, rather than a rate framework, 16 or 24 or some large number of trips, it would be a lot more variable from day to day, even for a given person. So I mean, that's some of the kind of the bottom line is accommodating the various ways of being delivered today without getting overly complicated in our approach to reimbursement. But you know, I understand the points being made today that you have the fixed routes, you have the curb to curb, and then you have different driver qualifications, licensure qualifications, you have different vehicle sizes and costs. We certainly are not ignorant of that, but it's how do we build a reimbursement framework that takes all that into account. And do we have a rate that is largely reflective and works as a reasonable approximation, or do we need to do something that's more nuanced? And if you think that there's something that requires a greater number of different transportation rates, that's the sort of feedback that we're talking.
Michelle Ramirez. I just wanted to ask about the fiscal analysis that's going to be presented. Many of the rates that we discussed today just looking at the Alta vendors here, we've experienced that it's going to be a reduction in some of those rate codes. So is that going to be included in the fiscal analysis, or is it only those rates that will show an increase, a cost increase?
Well, no,
We're going to include the reductions as well?
Yeah, absolutely. That's all part of the overall bottom line. Again, it's being done at the service code level. So what the total estimated change is for each of the individual service codes that we've talked about. And some of those, a small number might have net reductions, but they will certainly be included. We're not hiding the ball on anything.
Jordan Lindsay with the Arc of California. And I just want to make a comment regarding the comment period. And I want to push back a little bit on the notion that there isn't value in saying we don't like this rate. If there is, while that should accompany perhaps the reasons why, if the purpose is to comply with what's in ABX 2.1 and provide adequate access and choice, then I've already heard of 2 programs who have notified me that if this was enacted, the proposed rate today, tomorrow they said we're out. So I think there is value in commenting, we don't like this rate because it does not comply with what we are trying to accomplish here.
And I certainly didn't say that you cannot submit those comments, but I said that doesn't give us much that's actionable. So again, people are welcome to comment on anything and everything, but what's going to be, I think, to your benefit is to be specific in what you would change in the rate models. I mean, we put forward, we've shown ours, so to speak, we put forward a draft rate model, and we've been detailed and thorough, I think, in our documentation of how those were developed. And we'd like to see comments that are specifically related to those assumptions so that we can make a determination of whether or not adjustments are necessary. Now, if folks want to say they don't like the rate, that's certainly fine. I just don't see that there's going to be a whole lot that we can do in response to that comment.
Returning to the question about the fiscal analysis, you indicated that both positive and negative numbers would of course be included, but will that analysis include estimated net effect for various services broken out by service code or by general service type, or will it just be a singular number?
By service code. We're going to show by service code.
Thank you.
The total aggregate change by service code, which will then sum up to a bottom line across all the service codes in the state. It will be crosswalked against the existing service codes, yes. Well, there's 1 or 2 minor exceptions. We don't show 894 as a standalone number because it would just show a negative number, you know, a minus 100%, because we go from whatever it is today to 0, but that's been wrapped in to 896. But I think we footnoted that to make sure folks are aware of when we make those sorts of decisions.
Hi, Mike Lysenko with UCP. Just a quick question on the overall fiscal impact. We've kind of been muttering at this table, wondering, is that going to be delivered, or is that, do you currently have a number for this coming year?
It's going to be submitted on Friday.
Okay.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
And another question in regards to, are any revisions to the rate study going to be provided to the community at all before May 1st or after May 1st when the final draft is submitted? And forgive me if you've already addressed this.
I think it's safe to say that if revisions are made to the rate model, that's going to be communicated. So if changes are made to these draft rate models, that will need to be communicated publicly. I mean, I don't know exactly what that forum looks like. If changes are made, that's going to be done, I think, in a transparent fashion like we've tried to do throughout this project.
Margie said I could talk. My name is Jackie Dillard-Foss. One is the question on the comments, and I agree. It's trying to figure out to say the 5%, ABX 2-1 does address a 5% across the board for certain categories. So when we address a comment and the regulation that applies to that, similar to the FLSA and wage order 15 and supported living, and you keep hearing around the 5.82%, it'd be beneficial to attach the regulation that we're speaking of in our comments back to you?
So you're welcome to either attach it or to provide a reference.
The reference card, okay. The other one is, because wages are our biggest driver, obviously, and I'm looking at the BLS data, and I've been conflicted with supported living and independent living. You just weighted ILS and SLS the exact same.
Right.
So if we look at the BLS data, we say, here's where, because I think the best definition I can say is that supported living does have a high component of personal assistance and training and habilitation, where if you're looking at independent living, you're predominantly training and habilitation. So if I look at the BLS data and I say, this is where I think you're off on your weighted average, because that's how I figured you figured just looking at that data. So that would be the best comment back to you to say, here's where I'm conflicted with the ILS and the weighted average on the wage.
Absolutely, a very good example.
Okay, great, thank you.
Will the comments, will the feedback that you receive be made public?
I think the director responded to Lori's comment on that question.
I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
So I won't belabor the points of exempt staff versus hourly for mid-managers or the overtime at this moment, but I will definitely submit my comments along with various groups by March 22nd. What I wanted to take a moment to do is thank DDS and Burns & Associates for getting us to this point where we're actually sitting in a room and discussing rates. I definitely appreciate that. I guess I will throw in a tidbit about overtime. The overtime throws my agency, a mid-sized agency, into a loss on various months. And so it's a significant factor for many of our agencies, my size, larger or smaller. But in addition to my thanks to DDS and Burns & Associates, to you in particular, Stephen, you have an impressive memory to retain and communicate detail. And I think that you made this day and a half easy to get through.
Can you hear me? I'm one of the vendors that experienced the heartbreak of having to close a facility because of rates. So when I'm looking at the combining of levels, we are a 4D. If we are combined with, so anything from a 4A to a 4G, I believe, did not have a weeknight staff. Based on the labor code, we were allowed to take a 8-hour sleep credit. So if I take now and make my staff a weeknight staff, 8 hours, 56 hours a week times the hourly rate, I'm at another $1,200 a week in wages. So not only can I not get staff at minimum wage for NOC staff, but to have a weeknight staff in a home that doesn't need it doesn't make any sense, because then I'm taking away the hours that I could be with the consumers during the day hours, taking them places and enhancing their life. Instead, I have a staff sitting there with everybody else is asleep, and they'll be asleep. So also by rounding us all together, a 4D now has 280 hours required of staffing, where we were at 276. Though 4 hours doesn't seem like a lot, we're struggling as it is. It also requires us 4 additional consulting hours. And our consultants range from $65 to $85 an hour. So as I calculate this as a 4D, this would make us have to close another facility.
Thank you.
Sorry, I think my question was misunderstood. I wasn't asking if we were going to see responses from the comments. I was asking, are we going to see the public comments? Will they be made public?
Yeah, we'll make those public as well.
I appreciate that some things require regulation changes. a whole phase-in, can you speak a little bit about, will we see a list of what things require regulatory changes? Will there be any recommendations about how it would ramp up or what implementation would look like, assuming you were, it was endorsed and funded?
So to the first part of that question, I tried to respond to that earlier. The premise in terms of how we've laid out the PowerPoint and the report itself, which kind of follows this model, is highlighting those areas, although we're not specific about this specific title or the specific regulation, to point out the things that we think require some sort of adjustment. That's part of our decision-making process in terms of what to put in here, is what would require some change. More broadly than that, I think there's some desire to build regulations for some services that don't have any regulations today. So some of those miscellaneous service codes in particular. So there'll be a fair amount of infrastructure built around those. In terms of a list, ultimately at some point something will have to be put forward. We're not there yet. I mean, we've identified things at a high level and started to track what the specific references are. We don't have that in consolidated fashion at this point in time. To the second part of your question, I think determinations about what gets done with the rate study is kind of outside of the responsibility here, and so that's going to have to be part of a broader deliberative process that includes folks probably not in this room.
Late question come in. Will a recommendation be made to how often the legislature should revisit this model? Is there any consideration into that? Obviously, it's dynamic and can be updated. Will there be any consideration in narrative or anything like that as to how that should be done, what process should be used, etc.?
I think one of the points that we're going to emphasize is the approach that we've taken to rate setting lends itself to being updated. Are we going to say that it ought to be updated on any specific time frame? I don't think that is.
One comment, I think it's been brought up earlier in the process that we are not likely to catch every example of every client that's going to need services under this model, and to do so would just not be realistic. So I guess the question or the comment is that I'd encourage the department or Burns or somebody to think about a mechanism built into this for providers, regional centers, and clients when there's broad agreement that a service that we thought would be sufficient for 100% of clients isn't, that there's a mechanism that, you know, that we can use to request an adjustment, a change, a new vendor. We need something just so that we know that the 5 or 10 or 1% of folks that just this doesn't quite serve, that there is a mechanism by which we can reach broad agreement and get services for. So I would just encourage that.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to, well, is there any additional comments or questions before we close? I want to thank you all and for your attention and your thoughtful comments and the review that you've done over the last couple of days. And I know that you'll have a bit more time, and so we ask you to definitely let us know and submit your comments. And I appreciate especially the task force members and those that are here that are going to be part of the kind of the group that is going to be summarizing and submitting those. So we know that that's a commitment of time, and so we really do appreciate your agreement and willingness to do that. It's going to be very helpful. So please be safe. It's wet out there, and we want you to get home safe, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. And thank you.
We're down.